Gold tycoon in America in 1850. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 376 New Governor. After the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Liang Zhao boarded the ship to test the navigation capability of the bold and test the newly installed guns. The maximum speed provided by the San Francisco shipyard to Liang Zhao was indeed not false, but the coal consumption at the maximum speed was astonishing, and he did not dare to run at such a fast speed at ordinary times. Since Jinshan Bay is a very busy port with many civilian ships coming and going, it is not suitable to test the weapon systems on ships in Jinshan Bay. The bold left Jinshan Bay and went to the open sea to test the guns. Although it is called the open sea, it is actually only 20 nautical miles away from the coastline. The test area has been cleared of civilian ships and target ships have been set up. These target ships are all old and broken sailboats with a displacement of 200 to 300 tons. Liang Zhao attaches great importance to this first cruiser designed and built independently in California. The captain, first mate, second mate, third mate, navigator, gunner, quartermaster, sail and cable master, steam engine master, and mechanic on the ship are all backbones drawn from the Roland and Yang way. Even ordinary crew members were not recruited directly, but were carefully selected from the old employees of Global Shipping Company who had been serving Global Shipping Company since 1851. General, everything is ready, shall we conduct the test? Captain Lin Sen asked Liang Zhao. Lin Sen, a native of Haoguan, Fujian, worked as a boat boy on the trading merchant ship of Kitchen Foreign Company in his early years. Later, he worked as a sail and cable hand on the steamer of the British Steamship Company and also worked as a sail and cable chief. Since the British Shipping Company's sailors were treated very poorly and had deep discrimination against the so-called colored crew members. In 1850, after learning that there was a lot of gold in California, Lin Sen joined the gold rush without hesitation. However, he was soon cheated of all the money by his fellow villagers. Lin Sen, who was desperate, heard that the newly established Global Shipping Company was recruiting sailors, so he signed up to join the Global Shipping Company. Because of his relevant work experience in his early years, Lin Sen could speak fluent English. In addition, he was smart and clever. After joining the Global Shipping Company, Lin Sen was very successful. In August 1852, he passed the assessment and became the first mate of the Yang Wei. Don't worry, stand by. Liang Zhao had not had time to give Lin Sen an order, and saw a sailing warship with a displacement of nearly 2,000 tons and 2 decks passing through the nearby waters surrounded by 2 armed merchant ships. The 3 ships did not seem to have the intention to pass through this sea area quickly, but slowly slowed down and approached Liang Zhao's bold Hudson Bay Company's ship. The weather was very good today. Through the telescope, Fremont could see the flags flying on the 3 ships clearly. The flags flying on the sailing warship was the flag of the Crown Colony of British Columbia. The flags of the other 2 armed merchant ships had the Union Jack of the British Empire in the upper left corner and the abbreviation of the Hudson Bay Company in the lower right corner, HBC, Hudson Bay Company. These were armed merchant ships of the Hudson Bay Company. A third-class ship. Where did those poor people in the Crown Colony of Columbia get the money to buy a third-class ship? Liang Zhao put down his telescope and frowned. This sailing warship flying the flag of the Crown Colony of Columbia has a displacement of nearly 2,000 tons, and there are at least more than 70 guns on board. According to the ship classification standards announced by the British in 1817, this is a third-class ship. The British Columbia colony is not so poor that it has no naval power, but its facade is a 1,000-ton, 2-deck 4th-class ship, which is also the flagship of their governor John McLaughlin. The remaining naval forces are 2 single-deck 5th-class ships that have long been retired from the Royal Navy, and 3 mail ships. This is the entire naval power of the Columbia colony. The British Empire has many colonies, and its colonial categories are mainly divided into 2 types according to the manifestation of Britain's sovereignty over the colonies: company colonies, crown colonies, and later dominions. The representatives of company colonies are the East India Company and the Hudson Bay Company. There are more crown colonies, from the Columbia region bordering the Oregon Territory of the United States, where there is a border dispute, to Southwest Wales, Western Australia, South Australia, and even Cape Town, all of which are crown colonies. The difference between the two can be seen from the literal meaning. Crown colonies are colonies directly governed by the King of England, while company colonies are colonies operated and managed by chartered colonial companies. Dominions are advanced versions of the two, enjoying a relatively high degree of autonomy. In addition to internal autonomy, dominions can also formulate their own trade policies, have limited independent foreign policies, no right to declare war, and a certain number of troops. As for the advanced version of dominions, that is independence. Canada, the neighbor to the north of the United States, became a British dominion in 1867, and is still in the version of company colonies and crown colonies. In addition to the vast area controlled by the Hudson Bay Company, the southeastern region of Canada and the Pacific coast bordering the Oregon Territory of the United States are all crown territories. Interestingly, the Hudson Bay Company still exists in the 21st century and operates retail chains and logistics businesses. 5 years ago, this place was still a wilderness, and there were not many people on the entire west coast of the United States. Putting aside the attraction of the gold rush to the population growth rate here is really too scary, George, the former governor of Hudson Bay, who has already stepped down, said. This time, he sent his good friend Elliot to British Columbia, which is the Crown Territory north of the Oregon Territory of the United States, to serve as governor. The rapid expansion of the population on the west coast of the United States has made several governors in Canada, especially the governor of British Columbia and the governor of Hudson Bay, deeply uneasy. As the number of Chinese immigrants on the west coast of the United States has increased, George recommended Elliot, who knows the Chinese very well, to serve as the governor of British Columbia to curb the Chinese power and the further expansion of American power on the west coast, posing a threat to their colonies. It's really scary that California can build warships in less than 5 years. The growing strength of the west coast of America is indeed a great threat to our Crown of Columbia. These yellow people will spread to the entire North American continent like a disaster, polluting this clean new continent. I really don't know what the Yankees and Dixies in America think, allowing the yellow people to grow on their west coast. Elliot agreed deeply. China has a population of 1/3 of the world. If the Chinese are allowed to enter the New World of America, sooner or later, the white residents of the New World will be diluted into ethnic minorities by them. Chapter 377 Crash. Compared to the yellow race, the black problem is now a more serious problem in the United States, George said, with his hands behind his back, looking at the strange warship flying the California Bear flag and the American Stars and Stripes not far away. You participated in the trade war between Britain and China 13 years ago, and you know the Chinese better. That's why I recommend you to be the new governor of Columbia. McLaughlin, that drunkard, can deal with the Native Americans, but he doesn't understand the Chinese and can't deal with these Chinese on the west coast. As soon as George finished speaking, the strange-looking warship opened fire on several dilapidated target ships. The naval guns on the warship fired one after another. After a round of shooting, a dilapidated target ship was riddled with holes and sank. The naval guns involved in this round of shooting included 4 secondary guns and 2 main guns on the left. Except for 1 main gun and 1 secondary gun that landed a little far from the target, the remaining 1 main gun and 3 secondary guns either hit the target or the shells landed near the target. The target ship was nearly 1 nautical mile away from the battleship. Shooting such a small target at a distance of 1 nautical mile, even if it was a stationary target, was a very good result. Can America produce naval guns with such high accuracy? This round of shooting surprised Elliot greatly. Although after firing, the warship with a strange appearance fell into turbulence, resulting in the second round of shooting accuracy being unsatisfactory. But this is a problem of ship shooting. The naval guns carried by this battleship are still very good. The guns are good, but the tonnage of this ship is not worthy of such good guns. It's a bit of a waste of resources. Elliot stared at the bolt and said, "You are one of the few people in the British Empire who understands the Chinese. What do you think of Liang Zhao, their leader in California?" George said to Elliot. "According to the information I have collected, although Liang Zhao was born into a traditional Chinese gentry official family, he is not a typical Chinese. Chinese bureaucrats are timid and pedantic. They only spend a lot of effort to study how to please their superiors who can decide their careers and even life and death, oppress and insult their subordinates, and drive their subordinates like cattle and horses. The lower-level Chinese people are also full of offer these bureaucrats, and they are eager for themselves and their children to pass the exams to become bureaucrats. The upper class leads by example, and the lower class follows suit. The whole country is indifferent to affairs outside the empire, believing that it is the world's largest country and the center of the world. Therefore, this huge empire is lifeless and has no vitality. These stupid, arrogant and ignorant Chinese bureaucrats are extremely repulsive and full of fear towards foreign forces and new affairs. This is why we were able to defeat this behemoth in the trade war with China. Elliot held his chin, thought for a while and said, "But Liang Zhao has nothing to do with these. He is not a typical Chinese. I cannot make a more rigorous assessment and judgment of this person based on my past experience. He controlled California, became a hero of America twice, and now has become the youngest brigadier general in the history of America. Even if the English achieved these achievements in America, it would be a legend. But how good can he be? The Chinese are addicted to lipstick. As long as the Chinese in California are addicted to lipstick, Liang Zhao will not be able to make much waves. Lipstick is really a good thing, on the bold." After several rounds of test firing on the bold, Liang Zhao held the mast and said to Jeremiah, "The recoil of the artillery is too large. The ship is so bumpy after firing a few shots. This will reduce the efficiency and accuracy of continuous shooting. The bold cannot carry such a large number of artillery, but if it is replaced with a smaller artillery, it may cause damage to the first and second class battleships," Jeremiah said with some embarrassment. For naval guns, Jeremiah's view is that the larger the caliber, the better, and the larger the caliber, the better. Reducing the caliber and number of the guns after we go back, I want a warship with balanced performance, Liang Zhao interrupted Jeremiah. Jeremiah, I know you want the warships we build to be equipped with larger guns, but I believe that sooner or later, our shipyard will be able to build warships of 5,000 tons or even tens of thousands of tons. On that day, we can carry as many guns as we want. Okay, sir, I will modify the bold after I go back and reconfigure the guns on the ship. Jeremiah nodded after a moment of silence. As soon as possible, I will take this ship to Borneo, Liang Zhao explained. General. The British ship sent someone to pass on a message, saying that their new governor hopes to visit our ship. How should we reply? Lin Sen trotted to Liang Zhao and asked for instructions. Tell them that our ship has a malfunction and is very dangerous. For the safety of their new governor, it is better not to come to visit, Liang Zhao said. This is his new ship, and he doesn't want the British to see it before it is put into service. British Columbia hasn't changed its governor for more than 10 years. Changing the governor now is obviously targeting us. Hearing that Britain had changed the governor of British Columbia, Fremont couldn't help but frown. What British Columbia? That's the outer Oregon Territory. The Oregon Territory has been an inseparable part of our America since ancient times, Liang Zhao corrected. Fremont slapped his forehead and smiled knowingly. Yes, that's the outer Oregon Territory. British ship. British ship is approaching. Flagman. Quickly signal them to slow down and stop. If they don't, they will collide. While Liang Zhao and Fremont were talking, Jeremiah suddenly exclaimed. Liang Zhao turned his head and saw that the third-class ship flying the British Columbia Crown flag was rushing towards them, with no intention of slowing down. Since they rudely rejected us and didn't want us to visit their warships, then we will scare them and give them a warning, Elliot said condescendingly, looking down at the bold, which was only about half the tonnage of this third-class ship. Elliot's third-class ship had a larger tonnage and had an advantage in the collision. Moreover, Elliot also believed that the skilled British crew on the ship could control the force of the collision and produce a slight bump with the opponent to scare the opponent. Seeing the British ship coming, Lin Sen hurriedly ordered to avoid the collision of the British ship at full speed. The sail and rigging hands also quickly lowered the sails and adjusted the angle to use the wind to provide acceleration for the ship. Because the opponent's ship was too fast and was heading straight for the bold, the stern was still rubbed by the British ship. Although it was just a rub, the bold was small after all, and it was rubbed by a large ship of about 2,000 tons, and the ship still tilted to a certain extent. Fortunately, the wind was strong at this time. Lin Sen, who had been the sail and rigging captain, commanded the sail and rigging hands to adjust the sails, using the wind to offset the ship's roll, stabilize the ship's posture, and no capsizing occurred. Just as the crew on the bold breathed a sigh of relief, fortunately they had escaped this catastrophe. As the two ships passed each other, they could hear the teasing laughter of the British crew. Liang Zhao looked at the third-class ship passing by at the stern, which was the culprit of the accident. He looked at the British crew on the British ship who were cheering and making a fuss, and the two big men on the deck who looked quite important. He raised his middle finger and extended a friendly and cordial greeting. Then Liang Zhao walked to the bow, and his angry eyes were fixed on an armed merchant ship in front of him flying the flag of the Hudson's Bay Company. The tonnage of this armed merchant ship was about 700 to 800 tons, which was smaller than the Bold. Thinking of the Bold's design with a ram, Liang Zhao pointed at the Hudson's Bay Company's armed merchant ship and said to Lin Sen in an unquestionable tone, "Ram into it." If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 378 Impact. Add coal. Full sails. When Lin Sen heard that they were going to ram the British armed merchant ship, he instantly became excited. The Bold was small and could not ram a third-class warship, so how could it not ram a small armed merchant ship? If this continues, it may lead to a diplomatic dispute, Jeremiah said with concern. We have reminded them to leave the sea area. It is they who have repeatedly crossed our bottom line. All the consequences will be borne by them. Liang Zhao was not moved at all. If he did not leave a deep impression on the new governor today, Elliot would only be more aggressive and more aggressive in the future. The British have always been unreasonable. Since they want to show us their power, we will also show them our power. Fremont supported Liang Zhao's approach. If they had not just barely avoided the collision of the British warship, God knows whether they would have gone to the sea to feed the fish. Liang Zhao still remained rational. As long as he did not fire, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs would still have room to maneuver. They had already informed the British who wanted to approach that the Audacious had a malfunction, and it was the British who insisted on approaching and ramming their ship, so Liang Zhao could not be blamed. As the Audacious and the armed merchant ship got closer and closer, it was the British's turn to panic. The British crew on the armed merchant ship that was about to be rammed panicked for a moment, and hurriedly sent flags to George and Elliot to ask for permission to open fire. George and Elliot had already aimed the cannons on the side of the ship at the Audacious, and sent flags to order the Audacious to stop. Stop. Stop quickly. You stupid Chinese and Americans, are you crazy? Do you know what you are doing? George cursed incoherently across the sea, venting his inner anger. George was about to order the Audacious to fire to warn the Audacious and force the Audacious to stop their reckless behavior, but the swivel at the stern of the Audacious, which could rotate 360 degrees, had already pointed the muzzle of the 8-inch naval gun at them. No shooting on the Yukon. No shooting on the Glass and Kangaroo. Elliot still retained a trace of rationality and ordered no shooting. The Yukon was the third-class battleship they were on now, and the Glass and Kangaroo were two armed merchant ships of the Hudson's Bay Company. Stop. Stop now. Damn it. If you don't give them a warning, they will hit the Glass. George's angry tone was accompanied by a trace of heartache. The Kangaroo and the Glass were not only the property of the Hudson's Bay Company, but also his private property. And the other party was driving the ship towards his private property, the Glass. There was no intention of stopping at all. Sir. Once the guns are fired, the nature of the incident will be different. As far as I know, Liang Zhao has a 2,000-ton battleship, a 1,000-ton battleship and several patrol boats in California. Once the conflict escalates, we have no advantage in the sea area. We will suffer. Elliot was also sweating in his heart. He knew that he could not evaluate Liang Zhao in the same way as he usually evaluated the Chinese. This guy was not a coward at all. God knows what kind of desperate people this guy and the sailors he brought with him would be. Amid the horrified expressions and vulgar roars of the 70 or 80 British crew members on the Glass, the ram of the Bold hit the side of the Glass firmly. The Glass was an old wooden sailing merchant ship, which could withstand the fierce attack of the Bold. With a violent shake, the ram of the Bold quickly knocked a hole in the side of the Glass. Liang Zhao also felt a huge vibration caused by the collision on the Bold. Since the Bold was moving at full speed at 14-15 knots, it did not stop when it hit the Glass. The ship continued to push the Glass forward with great inertia. The cracks on the side of the Glass became larger and larger, and finally became so large that the cargo in the cabin leaked directly from the cargo hold and fell into the sea one after another. Soon, dozens of wooden boxes carrying cargo floated in the sea near the two ships. Seeing that the damage on the Glass was irreversible and the sinking was only a matter of time, the captain of the Glass had to order everyone to abandon the ship and escape. The Bold was a new ship built to the standard of a warship, and the materials were strong. Therefore, the Bold only suffered some minor damage in the collision. Liang Zhao was very curious about what cargo the British merchant ship was holding, and ordered the salvage of the cargo floating on the Sea of the Glass. Soon, a wooden cargo box was salvaged, with a British East India Company's trademark on a blue background and white label on it. Fu Shouguo, Lin Sen, who had worked for a British shipping company, was no stranger to this kind of box. Before the Opium War, British merchant ships heading to Guangzhou, whether passenger ships or cargo ships, would more or less smuggle some Fu Shouguo into Guangzhou. Pried open, Liang Zhao's face became gloomy, and he ordered the salvaged wooden cargo box to be pried open. Lin Sen found a crowbar, pried open the wooden box, took out the goods from the wooden box, smelled them closely, nodded and said to Liang Zhao, "It is indeed Fu Shouguo." Then the crew salvaged several more wooden cargo boxes. Not surprisingly, these boxes were filled with Fu Shouguo. As for the cargo loaded on the Kangaroo, another Hudson Bay Company cargo ship, there is no doubt that it must be Fu Shouguo. The west coast of North America is sparsely populated, and most of the population is concentrated in several large settlements in California. These British people brought 2 ships of oxalis at once, and it was obvious where they wanted to sell it. Sell it to the Native Americans? Just thinking about it is nonsense. How many Native Americans can there be on the entire west coast? The native Indians can't digest so much oxalis even if they eat it as salt. What's more, how many dollars can these poor Native Americans have in their pockets? Only California, which is rich in gold and has a gradually developing economy, can digest these oxalis. The British are still determined to destroy us, Lin Sen said angrily. They have sold the oxalis to California, not to mention Lin Sen. Even Fremont and Jeremiah's faces became ugly. Fremont naturally knew why Britain fought the trade war against China more than a decade ago. California not only has Chinese immigrants, but also Yankee immigrants, Dixie immigrants, Irish immigrants, French immigrants and other ethnic immigrants. But they all have a new identity, that is, Americans. Narcotics have no nationality. If Chinese people can become addicted, Yankees and Dixies will naturally become addicted as well. In view of this, when California was founded, the California elders had reached a consensus to write the prohibition of opium-based drugs into California state law. Even medical anesthetics were listed as controlled substances for control. Are the British planning to turn us Americans into the sick men of North America? The British really know how to do business, using the East India Company's bomb grown in South Asia to exchange for the gold produced in California. Fremont clenched his fists, and his eyes were full of murderous intent as he looked at the British ship. Chapter 379 Sven Island. Stop. Stop now. Those are my goods. You are invading my private property. 2 British ships in good condition, Yukon and Kangaroo, were rescuing the crew members of Glass who fell into the water. The crew members of the Bold were busy with the goods that fell into the water from the Glass merchant ship. This made George so angry that he waved his fist at the Bold, wishing to smash it with one punch. After competing with the British to salvage the goods floating on the sea, Liang Zhao left amid the protests of the British crew and returned to San Francisco and Jinshan Bay. There are coastal artillery batteries in the Golden Gate Strait to protect San Francisco. If they have the guts, they can chase it to the Golden Gate Strait. Liang Zhao looked back at these British ships. These British ships had no intention of chasing the Bold. Instead, after salvaging the remaining goods and the crew members who fell into the water, they watched the Glass sink to the bottom of the sea and finally returned to their nest in the north in disgrace. Hurry up the development of ironclad ships. The British are very vengeful. They will not forget the loss they suffered today, Liang Zhao explained to Jeremiah. He can be right for a while and make the British suffer temporarily, but it is only for a while. When they withdraw from the battlefield in the Near East, the British will have plenty of time to deal with him. As for being a drug for the British, this is an unrealistic idea. The British are very happy to see that being a drug for the British will cause trouble for the United States, a former British colony, on the North American continent. But the premise is that you are white, and the most important thing is not to touch the fundamental interests of the British, that is, the economic interests of the British. I'm sorry, Liang Zhao can't do this. If he wants to industrialize, he will inevitably compete with the British. This is an unavoidable problem. I used to think that it was a waste to waste money on building warships. Today's events made me realize that it is very necessary for California to manufacture warships by itself and maintain a maritime force that can protect itself, Jeremiah sighed. The U.S. Navy has no fleet on the Pacific coast, and the Navy Department has no idea of establishing a Pacific fleet. After all, the Navy Department's budget is barely enough to maintain the current size of the Navy and ensure the security of the Atlantic coastal areas. Not to mention the establishment of a Pacific fleet to ensure the coastal security of the Pacific coastal areas. If California wants to deal with threats from the sea, the U.S. Navy cannot be relied on, and it can only rely on its own strength. That's good to know. Just do it, Jeremiah. I believe in your ability. Just come to me if the shipyard needs anything, Liang Zhao said with his hands on Jeremiah's shoulders. Today's incident was caused by the British being rude first. I will submit a report to Congress to clarify the facts. After speaking, Fremont pointed to the opium salvaged from the sea and asked, "What do you plan to do with these things? Take them back and destroy them." Destroy? Liang Zhao stared at the opium and shook his head and said, "The British transported these things from South Asia all the way here. It would be a pity to destroy them directly. They are so valuable. Opium is not only for inhalation. Hospitals in California and military doctors and military camps use opium as a pain reliever and cough reliever. Narcotics are a double-edged sword. If used properly, they are medicines, but if used improperly, they are addictive drugs. However, California medicine certainly does not need so much oxydiazole. The excess oxydiazole must be dealt with in a way to make these things play their due value." Liang Zhao has reached a cooperation with the Rothschild family and uses the Rothschild family's sales channels in Europe to sell kerosene. At present, the demand for kerosene is so great that almost every week, different amounts of kerosene and other goods are shipped from Los Angeles and San Francisco to Europe. The Rothschild family's sales channels in Europe naturally include channels in the British market. Liang Zhao can still smuggle some oxydiazole into these goods and transport them to the British market. What's more, Jardine Mason has even opened a tobacco shop in London and sold the oxydiazole grown in their Mexican plantations. It can be seen that this thing also has a market in the UK. Since the British like oxydiazole, it would be okay to let them taste the authentic oxydiazole produced by the British East India Company. At the same time, thousands of miles away, in the clear sky of Micronesia in the Central Pacific Ocean, Sven was looking for the island rich in phosphate minerals where birds poop based on the vague coordinates given by Liang Zhao. 60 kilometers south of the equator, between 165 degrees and 169 degrees east longitude. After several days of sailing, an elliptical coral reef island appeared in front of Sven. Sven and the navigator immediately calculated the longitude and latitude of the island, and finally determined that the longitude of the coral island was about 166.5 degrees. Is there really such an island? Are the records of those Chinese navigators true? Sven asked with suspicion. Within the area given by Liang Zhao, only this coral island met the requirements. Sven ordered his James Day to sail around the coral island, firstly to roughly map the coral island, and secondly to confirm whether anyone else had already arrived first, so as to avoid unnecessary disputes. After some rough surveying, Sven estimated that the coral island was about 6 kilometers long, 4 kilometers wide, 30 kilometers in circumference, and 22 to 23 square kilometers in land area. It was a small island. Fortunately, no one else had gotten there first. Only a few natives looked curiously at the monster under Sven's feet, which was emitting black smoke and moving freely on the sea. After seeing the James Day, some natives ran away, while others bowed down to the James Day. The sea conditions around this small island were unknown. The James Day was a large paddle steamer with a displacement of more than 2,000 tons. There were few other ships passing by near this sea area. Once the ship ran aground, the consequences would be disastrous. Therefore, Sven could only put down 3 lifeboats, take 23 fully armed crew members, and the California scientific research personnel on board to board the coral island. Sven took out some glass beads, bottles, knives, and cotton cloth to communicate with the local natives. Sven said that this was a gift for them. After more than 10 minutes of difficult communication, the natives finally understood what Sven meant and accepted Sven's gift very happily. Then Sven pointed to his mouth and gestured to ask the local natives for fresh food and drinking water. The local natives soon understood what Sven meant. Sven wanted to exchange these things with them for food. Soon, the chief asked the young people in the tribe to bring some bananas, coconuts, fish, seabirds, mice and some unknown mammals. This is the daily food of the local natives. The crew members now vomit when they see fish and mice, so they naturally have no appetite. As for those unknown mammals, they don't dare to eat them. However, the tropical fruits such as bananas and coconuts brought by the natives were quickly snatched up. This is the nutrition they need to consume now. Sven also cracked a coconut and poured the coconut juice into his mouth. After eating, Sven sent 8 crew members to protect the scientific research personnel in the search for phosphate mines. Sven also exchanged some bananas and coconuts with the local natives, and sent people to deliver these fresh fruits to the James Day for the crew on the ship to enjoy. He took 12 crew members to look for fresh water on the island. There were flocks of birds on the island, one after another. Before long, Sven's body was covered with bird droppings falling from the sky. Looking at the densely packed black, brown, cyan, white, gray, yellow and white bird droppings on his body, Sven was not angry but happy. Since there are so many birds on the island, there will naturally be a lot of phosphate. California's scientific research personnel told him that phosphate ore is formed by the changes of bird droppings over tens of thousands of years. This is good news. Last year, California spent more than $5 million to import these bird droppings from Peru, Chile and Bolivia. If this island really has rich phosphate mines, the value of this island will be inestimable. California can also get rid of the situation where phosphate mines are strangled by the British and South Americans. After all, the phosphate mines currently used in California are all minted with California dollars, that is, heavy gold. More importantly, he discovered the island, and he himself could also gain substantial benefits from it. Sven and his crew went around the tiny island but could not find any fresh water. The surface of the island is too permeable, and it is difficult to retain fresh water. As for rivers, they do not exist. There is a small lake, but it is a saltwater lake. Fortunately, the local indigenous people told him that it often rains here, and he can collect some rainwater when it rains and filter it for drinking. After a few days of investigation, the scientific expedition personnel in California brought Sven the expected good news. The island is indeed rich in phosphate mines, very high-quality phosphate mines. When Sven asked about the approximate reserves, the scientific expedition personnel pondered for a long time and gave a reply: "It is difficult to estimate." Sven jumped up excitedly. He ran under a coconut tree, pulled out the Bowie hunting knife at his waist, and scratched a few letters on the trunk of the coconut tree. Sven Island. This island will be called Sven Island from now on. Sven admired the letters he carved and muttered to himself. Chapter 380, Return of Umbrella Corporation. 1853, Martin, the vice president of Umbrella Corporation, who had been away from California for 3 years, finally returned to San Francisco after a long absence. A large armed merchant ship named Siren sailed into the port of San Francisco with a red and white umbrella-shaped flag. Siren was escorted by the Chiaoyang light cruiser transferred from Nagasaki. The workers and people at the port speculated that the armed merchant ship flying the umbrella-shaped flag must be loaded with gold that the umbrella company had found in Australia. After all, apart from gold, there was no cargo that could make a cruiser escort it. There were many small ships with a displacement of about 500 tons, such as the Loach-class patrol boats in California, but there were only 4 large ships above 1,000 tons, including the Bold, which had just been launched. In fact, the speculation of these port workers and people was correct. The Siren armed merchant ship carried part of the gold that Umbrella Company had found in Australia in the past 3 years. Although it was only a part of it, the value of the gold reached $11 million. In addition to the gold, there were 2 guests who came to San Francisco on the ship. They were Wang Jia and Liu Shanbang, the leaders of Dagan Company. "Boss, the gold you wanted has been successfully transported to San Francisco. The journey was very smooth. The gold on the ship was safe and sound, and not a single bit was lost." Martin took off his hat and saluted Liang Zhao, and then reported to Liang Zhao about the situation of Umbrella in Australia. Since Umbrella was born out of Xiangshan Gold Mining Company, it mastered the advanced gold mining technology of Xiangshan Gold Mining Company at that time, had the most advanced gold mining equipment, the most skilled gold mining workers, and the support of California Mercury Mine. After Umbrella arrived in Australia, it was a dimensionality reduction attack on the local small gold mining teams that still used traditional methods to mine gold in Australia. Therefore, Umbrella is now the largest gold mining company in Australia. Although out of consideration for human relations, Umbrella had to share the gold mining results with local snakes such as Augustus, the governor of New South Wales, Australia. In order to obtain the right to continue gold mining in Australia, Umbrella was still able to grab a large amount of gold from Australia. Well done, Martin, Liang Zhao encouraged. Thank you for your compliment. This is a Christmas blessing from the governor of New South Wales, Augustus. Martin took out a letter from his briefcase and handed it to Liang Zhao. Boss, if there is nothing else, I will go back to spend Christmas with my family. Martin came to California to pan for gold with a Boston company in 1849. He was one of the 49-year-old miners. When he served as the vice president of Umbrella Company and went to Australia to pan for gold, his family had not been taken to San Francisco by Liang Zhao. Martin had not seen his wife and children for 4 years. Now Martin just wanted to hand over his work as soon as possible and go home to reunite with his family. I haven't seen my family for 4 years, and I'm going back to spend Christmas with my family empty-handed, Liang Zhao asked. Australia is a remote and poor place, and there is nothing to bring. I came back in a hurry, so I didn't care about such trivial matters. I'm going to the street to buy some things to take home. Thank you for reminding me. After Liang Zhao's reminder, Martin scratched his head and said embarrassedly, "Tonight is Christmas Eve. You can't buy many good things on the street now. Christmas is a legal holiday in California. Many stores are closed now." Liang Zhao waved to the back and Carnegie drove a carriage full of gifts up. "The gifts are all prepared for you. I'll give you a month off so that you can spend time with your family." "Thank you, boss. I didn't expect you to be so thoughtful." Martin's nose was sore. He didn't expect Liang Zhao to consider these trivial matters for him. In addition, Captain Weber has also come to San Francisco. It is very likely that you will work with him in the future. Take some time to meet Captain Weber and Dr. Robinson. I think they will forgive you." Liang Zhao patted Martin on the shoulder and said to Martin. Martin was once a member of the Boston Company, which was full of talents. In the early days of the California Gold Rush, the Boston Company's gold rush was not smooth. Martin and Fuller stole the little gold left in Boston Company at Hawk's instigation and ran away. Later, after Hawk joined the Brandon gang, Martin and Fuller parted ways with Hawk and went to Nevada, where gold was rumored to be everywhere, to pan for gold. Fuller then committed suicide due to a mental breakdown. When Martin buried Fuller's body, he accidentally discovered the largest piece of gold in California's history, a piece of gold weighing 151 pounds. Of course, there is another version of this story, that is, Martin killed Fuller when he was not prepared in order to take the gold for himself. In order to escape legal sanctions, he made up a lie that he found the gold when burying Fuller's body, and used God's gift to wash away his sins. Especially his old friends in Boston Company, who believed in this statement. The gold panning history in Boston Company was a stain on Martin and a knot in Martin's heart. I know. Anyway, thank you, Martin, who was sad, bowed to Liang Zhao, put on his hat, and led the horse to the address that he had written countless times on the envelope. After Martin left, Liang Zhao asked Carnegie to give a $10 bonus to each of the crew members on the Kinglan and Cheoiong who were responsible for escorting the gold and the employees of the Umbrella Company for Christmas. Then he took the leaders of the Dagon Company, Wang Jia and Liu Shanbang, to Tingtao Garden for a discussion. Compared with the well-dressed and triumphant Martin, Wang Jia and Liu Shanbang looked a little plain. Both of them wore a half-new silk gown and a pair of cloth shoes with holes. The war that has lasted from 1850 to the present has not only exhausted the Chinese company organizations on the island of Borneo, but also exhausted their financial resources. As of 1854, some companies chose to surrender to the Dutch East India Company to get a chance to survive, such as the Lanfang Company. Some companies chose to fight to the death with the Dutch East India Company, and those who refused to surrender, such as Wang Jia and Liu Shanbang's Dagon Company. Wang Jia and Liu Shanbang had contacted Umbrella Company before. Umbrella Company also has many Chinese employees, and Umbrella Company and Chinese employees do not wear braids. Therefore, Wang Jia and Liu Shanbang were not surprised to see that Liang Zhao, the leader of Umbrella Company, did not wear braids. Mr. Liang is willing to lend a hand to the Dagon Company and our comrades in Borneo at a time of life and death. I am very grateful. Before sitting down, Wang Jia expressed his gratitude to Liang Zhao. Before Liang Zhao lent a hand, Dagon Company and Lanfang Company, which was still in the anti-Dutch United Front at that time, had jointly written to the Qing court with other local Chinese companies, hoping that the Qing court would lend a hand to them, even if it was just to express its attitude to the Dutch in diplomatic occasions. Unfortunately, the Qing dynasty did not care about the life and death of these overseas abandoned people, nor was it interested. Just when they were desperate, Liang Zhao's letter gave them hope again. However, Wang Jie and Liu Shanbang had no idea how much help Liang Zhao could provide them, and how much the Dagon Company and other Chinese companies that were still resisting would have to pay to get help from Liang Zhao. They even knew that Liang Zhao's purpose in helping them was just to open a plantation on the island of Borneo. Chapter 381 Borneo is in danger. No need to say polite words, tell me about the current situation on Borneo Island. Liang Zhao went straight to the point. It is very critical. Wang Jie first briefly summarized the current situation on Borneo Island to Liang Zhao, and then gave a detailed explanation. There are many forces on Borneo Island, but in essence, they are nothing more than the local chiefdom, our Chinese company, the Dutch East India Company, and the British who have infiltrated the Kuching area of Sarawak. The representative of the British is Sir James Brooke. I have talked about this with Liang Gongzu in a letter. According to Wang Jie's introduction, the Chinese on Borneo Island are currently mainly hiding in several settlements in the west of the island and the northwest of Pontianak in Sarawak. Since there is no fundamental conflict of interest between the Chinese, the British and the local chiefdoms, the relationship between these three forces is relatively relaxed. The local Sultan chiefdom uses the Chinese to mine minerals and develop land, and regularly charges some fees in return. As for the British, the local chiefdom, mainly Sultan Omar Ali of Brunei, was worried that the Chinese would become powerful on the island of Borneo, so he introduced British forces and wanted to use the British to contain the Chinese. At the same time, Brunei hoped that the British would prevent Brunei from being annexed by the Dutch East India Company while containing the Chinese. After all, at this time, the southern and eastern regions of Borneo were either directly annexed by the Dutch East India Company or became protectorates of the Dutch East India Company. This made the Brunei people uneasy and hoped that the British could prevent the Dutch East India Company from annexing Brunei. Sultan Omar Ali of Brunei was successful in this move, but not completely. The reason for the success was that the British were brought in, and Brunei was indeed not annexed by the Dutch East India Company. The reason for the failure was that most of Brunei's territory eventually became a British colony. This is also the reason why there are three countries on one island of Borneo, Kalimantan, in later generations. Except for 5,765 square kilometers of land that still belongs to Brunei, the area of Kalimantan is 743,000 square kilometers, slightly larger than China's Qinghai province. Most of the territory of Borneo belongs to Malaysia and Indonesia. Later, Malaysia, a former British colony, had a territory on Borneo Island, also known as East Malaysia, which is the territory of Brunei today, with an area of 190,000 square kilometers. As for the rest of Borneo Island, it became the territory of Indonesia, a former Dutch colony. The division of borders between countries on Borneo Island is also a microcosm of the colonial era in the 19th century. The heart of Brunei Sultan Omar Ali is indeed a bit big. He actually thinks that he can use the British without considering how much weight he has. How many Chinese are there on Borneo Island? How many people are there in the current control area of the Dagon Company and the 12th Company? After understanding the specific situation on Borneo Island, Liang Zhao asked about the issue he was most concerned about, that is, the Chinese population on Borneo Island and the population that Wang Jie, Liu Shanbang and others can directly control. We don't know exactly how many Chinese there are on Borneo. However, many of the Chinese on Borneo are concentrated in West Borneo, about 50,000. Among them, 20,000 people obey our Dagon Company and the 12th Company, and the remaining 30,000 people are controlled by the dog trader Liu Shaoxin and his son-in-law Yi Tingfan of the Lanfang Company. These dog traders help the Red Hair Devils to beat our own people and cut off our heads to seek credit for the Red Hair Devils. They are more cruel than the TMD Red Hair Devils. They don't even let go of women and children. When mentioning the Lanfang Company, Liu Shanbang, a Hakka from Lufen, Guangdong, who is tall and strong and has a long braid wrapped around his neck, was furious. In the early 19th century, in order to monopolize the mining industry in Borneo, the Dutch colluded with the indigenous sultans to repeatedly attack the territories of the Chinese companies. However, the fighting power of the indigenous sultans was touching, and they were all defeated by the Chinese armed forces. After failing to use the indigenous sultans to expel the Chinese by force, the Dutch East India Company then changed to economic infiltration, political inducement, and bribery and division to deal with the Chinese autonomous regime. Liu Zhao, the sixth general manager of the Lanfang Company, was the first to be seduced by the Dutch to rebel, and he and the senior executives of the Lanfang Company sold out the rights and interests of the Chinese companies. Lanfang then became an accomplice of the Dutch, and often sent troops to help the Dutch attack other Chinese companies. This is why after the end of the Dutch-Chinese War from 1850 to 1854, only the Lanfang Company among the Chinese companies was able to survive until the 1880s. During the 4-year Dutch-Chinese War, the senior executives of the Lanfang Company, headed by Liu Zhao, the 11th general manager of the Lanfang Company, stood on the side of the Dutch East India Company, provided the Dutch with intelligence on the Dagon Company and the 12 companies, and even sent troops to cooperate with the Dutch East India Company's army to attack the territories of these Chinese companies. The Dutch East India Company government then agreed to retain the independence of the Lanfang Republic until Liu Zhao died of illness. Since 1823, when Liu Zhao, the sixth general manager of the Lanfang Company, was willing to be a lackey of the Dutch-Indonesian colonial government and came forward to suppress other local compatriots. At this time, the Lanfang Republic had already changed, and had betrayed the original intention of Luo Fangbo, who was the founder of Lanfang. As Brother Liu said, the situation in Borneo is already precarious. The cities we hold are only Luai, Montradu, and Cebu. If Mr. Liang does not take action again, even Luai and Cebu will not be able to be defended. Once Luai and Cebu are broken, all men, women, old and young in the city will be enslaved and at the mercy of others, Wang Jia said with tears in his eyes, and after that, Wang Jia even knelt down to Liang Zhao. Liang Zhao was Wang Jia's last straw and the only person who had the hope of helping them directly. Liu Shanbang also listed the atrocities committed by Liu Zhao, the father-in-law and son-in-law, and the Dutch-Indonesian colonial government in West Borneo. It was routine to kidnap people as slaves, rape wives, and behead and abandon corpses. In order to please the Dutch, Liu Zhao and his son-in-law even sent people to capture beautiful virgin girls and send them to Batavia for the Dutch to have sex, and selected strong men to serve as free laborers for the Dutch, in order to please the Dutch colonial government and consolidate their dominance in the Lanfang Company with the support of the Dutch. Wang Jia and Liu Shanbang were right. The Dutch-Chinese War on Borneo was about to enter its 4th year. The Dagon Company and the 12 companies, which were under economic blockade, had a very difficult time. They could only fight the Dutch colonial government and their accomplice, the Lanfang Company, under the pressure of lack of clothing, food, and ammunition. On July 25, 1854, the Dagon Company was forced to withdraw from their last settlement, Luai, under the siege of Liu Zhao's armed forces of the Lanfang Company, and went to resist the company's last stronghold, Cebu. Soon, Cebu also fell under the siege of Dutch General Anderson. At this point, the Dutch colonial government finally cleared all the rebellious Chinese forces on the island of Borneo. Yaoer, you have always made your own decisions. I don't usually ask about it, but let me have a say about today's matter. We are all brothers, so I'll help you if I can. After hearing about what Liu Zhao, his father-in-law and his son-in-law and the Dutch-Indonesian government did on the island of Borneo, even the usually taciturn Denglan couldn't stand it anymore and couldn't help but interject. Mom, I have my own ideas. I will help those who should be helped. Liang Zhao nodded and gestured to Queen Muling to help Denglan down to rest. If Mr. Liang is willing to lend a hand, Mr. Liang has a share of the gold mines in West Borneo. Wang Jia gritted his teeth and gave up the interests of the gold mines in West Borneo. Liang Zhao owns gold mines in California, and even has a share in the gold mines in Australia. The gold mines in West Borneo have been mined for nearly 100 years, and he doesn't care about these scraps. Liang Zhao is not going to tear his face with the Dutch and start a war for the small profits of the gold mines in West Borneo. Liang Zhao, your rubber trees are all planted in Luai. If Luai is lost, your trees will be taken away by the Dutch. Liu Shanbang, who was born as a miner, was more impatient than Wang Jia and spoke without thinking. Old Liu, watch your words. Wang Jia immediately scolded Liu Shanbang and told him to watch his words. Liang Zhao was their last straw. If Liang Zhao was unwilling to help them, the demise of Chinese companies such as Dagon Company and 12 Company would only be a matter of time. Chapter 382 Everybody is a soldier. Mr. Liang, please forgive me for being rude. I am a rough man. I hope you will not bear grudges against me. Liu Shanbang stood up and clasped his fists to Liang Zhao to apologize. Mr. Liang, I have always been straightforward. Please forgive me for the offense, Wang Jie also said to Liang Zhao with an apologetic look. For the sake of our compatriots, I am willing to help you. Otherwise, I would not have taken you to San Francisco for discussion. The Dutch blockaded West Borneo from the sea. If the sea blockade is not broken, I will not be able to transport a large amount of supplies to support you. Do you think you can defeat the Dutch with only a small amount of material assistance? Liang Zhao asked Wang Jie and Liu Shanbang a soul-searching question. The answer is obvious, no. Since the outbreak of the Dutch-Chinese War, the Dutch have controlled the sea power. Most of the time, these Chinese resistance companies are on the defensive and rarely have the opportunity to take the initiative. Wang Jie and Liu Shanbang were silent after hearing this. Seeing that the two were silent, Liang Zhao continued, if you want to break through the Dutch blockade at sea, you must hurt them at sea, and only I have the ability to hurt the Dutch at sea and break through their blockade. The Dutch-Chinese War has entered its final stages, and the armed forces of the Dagon Company and the 12 companies have long been exhausted. It is unrealistic to rely solely on their strength to expel the Dutch colonial government forces on the island of Borneo. They do not have this ability. To win this war and obtain land on the island of Borneo, Liang Zhao must personally intervene to have hope. Defeat the red-haired devils at sea, Liu Shanbang said in disbelief with his eyes wide open. The red-haired devils have very strong naval power. If we fight with them on land, we can still resist them a little, but if we fight them at sea, we have no chance of winning. Old Liu. How can Mr. Liang be a man who speaks arrogantly? If he says there is, there is. Mr. Liang has a large ship like the Chaoyang. He has defeated Japan's 100,000 troops in Japan, so the mere red-haired devils are nothing to mention, Wang Jie said hurriedly. Liang Zhao wanted to intervene directly in the dispute on Borneo Island, which was extremely beneficial to the Chinese resistance companies on Borneo Island. Wang Jie was eager for Liang Zhao to intervene directly as soon as possible, preferably by sending troops. In that case, the pressure on their resistance companies would be much less. Liang Zhao took a sip of tea and then put forward his conditions. It is not impossible for me to send troops. Dagon Company and other Chinese resistance companies on Borneo Island will be incorporated into Umbrella Company. This is the condition for me to send troops. I still say the same old thing. The gold mining business on the island is still yours, and the other businesses are mine. Wang Jie and Liu Shanbang fell into a brief silence, but the severe situation on Borneo Island did not allow them to hesitate for too long, and they quickly gave their answers. As long as Mr. Liang is willing to help, Dagon Company and the 12th Company are willing to be incorporated into Mr. Liang's Umbrella Company. Wang Jie expressed his position and asked, I wonder when Mr. Liang will send troops. After the new year, Liang Zhao only gave a vague time. The allocation of materials, the mobilization of the army, and the preparation of public opinion all take time. Liang Zhao would not fight a war he was not sure of. Only after all these preparations were completed would Liang Zhao officially send out his troops. The Chaoyang, which had just returned to San Francisco, also needed time to replace the new Sacramento naval guns. Moreover, Liang Zhao's army included not only white soldiers but also Chinese soldiers. After the new year, the white soldiers had celebrated Christmas, and the Chinese soldiers had celebrated the Spring Festival before going to war. The morale of the soldiers would be even higher. Soldiers are also human beings. They were not allowed to celebrate the annual major festivals and had to go to war. These soldiers would inevitably have emotions. The impatient Liu Shanbang was about to emphasize to Liang Zhao the precarious situation on the island of Borneo, hoping that Liang Zhao could send troops immediately, but Wang Jie stopped Liu Shanbang. Wang Jie stepped forward and bowed deeply to Liang Zhao, then lifted his robe and knelt down, kowtowed heavily to Liang Zhao. On behalf of tens of thousands of people on Borneo Island, I thank Mr. Liang for saving my life. Since the outbreak of the Dutch-Chinese War, these overseas abandoned people in Borneo have been isolated and fighting alone. Liang Zhao is the first and only force that clearly stated that he would help them. For this reason alone, Liang Zhao deserves Wang Jie's respect. Liang Zhao stepped forward to help Wang Jie up and asked Wang Jie the last and most serious question. How many soldiers are available in the Dagon Company and the Chinese Resistance Company? Wang Jie, with tears in his eyes, replied resolutely, "Everyone is a soldier. Liang has prepared your meals for you two. After you finish eating, you two should have a good rest in Tingtao Garden. Later, reporters from newspapers will come to interview you. You only need to explain to these reporters the past experiences and current situation of the Chinese on Borneo Island." Liang Zhao nodded and said to Wang Jia. "Reporter," Wang Jia asked in confusion. "Just do as I say," Liang Zhao said. "I understand," Wang Jia nodded. "I have heard a little about the Chinese in Southeast Asia. As far as I know, the Chinese companies on Borneo Island are colonial companies of the Qing dynasty. There is also a saying that they are tributary states. Having lived in California for so long, Fremont has had a lot of contact with Chinese people on a daily basis. Although Fremont cannot write Chinese, he can still roughly understand Chinese conversations. If they are colonial companies or tributary states of the Qing dynasty, do they still need to ask us for help?" Liang Zhao said with a long sigh. That was to protect themselves by claiming to be a colonial company and tributary state of the Qing dynasty. It was just a fox pretending to be a tiger, but the tiger of the Qing dynasty was made of paper. They expressed their willingness to become a tributary state of the Qing dynasty at the end of the 18th century, but the Qing dynasty ignored their request. The identity of the Qing dynasty as a tributary state was indeed protected by the Chinese companies on Borneo Island headed by the Lanfang Company in the early days, making the Spanish, Dutch, and British wary of the Chinese forces on Borneo Island. But as the international reputation of the Qing dynasty plummeted and the lies were exposed, the Chinese forces on Borneo Island also ushered in their doomsday. Not being protected by the motherland is not only a tragedy for the Chinese on Borneo Island, but also a tragedy for all the Chinese in Southeast Asia. Immigration, trade, exploration, and even conquest, these things that Europeans did, the Chinese in Southeast Asia had also done, and much earlier than the Europeans. When the five barbarians invaded China, a small number of immigrants had already taken a boat south to find the peach blossom spring in their hearts overseas. After the fall of the Southern Song dynasty and Zheng He's voyages to the west, Chinese immigrants in Southeast Asia ushered in a wave of peaks. However, whether it was the Yuan dynasty or the Ming dynasty, the Central Plains dynasty's attitude towards these overseas immigrants was still indifferent. But in the Qing dynasty, the situation was completely different. In the late Ming and early Qing dynasties, a large number of immigrants who immigrated overseas were not just refugees who could not survive the famine and took a boat to make a living overseas. Instead, there were many literati, officials, and even former Ming royal family immigrants with strong political colors. Even the last emperor of the southern Ming dynasty, Emperor Yongle Zuyalang, fled to Myanmar. The Qing dynasty rulers, who had obtained the country improperly and were extremely inferior, had more hostility and vigilance towards overseas immigrants in addition to the indifference of the previous dynasty. It is not difficult to understand why the emperors of the Qing dynasty did not express anything after learning that the Chinese in Southeast Asia had been massacred, but applauded. After all, in their eyes, these Southeast Asian immigrants were either remnants of the previous dynasty or traitors. In the Red River Massacre in 1740, the Dutch-Indonesian colonial government instigated anti-Chinese riots in order to weaken the influence of the Chinese, and more than 10,000 Chinese were killed. Afterwards, the Dutch-Indonesian authorities were still wary of retaliation from the Qing dynasty and sent envoys to the capital to apologize. Emperor Qianlong was not angry but happy when he heard about this. He believed that it was the fault of overseas Chinese and did not hold the Dutch-Indonesian authorities responsible. This is why the Dutch-Indonesian authorities dared to act recklessly against the Chinese in their expansion movement on the island of Borneo today. Similar tragedies still occurred from time to time until the end of the 20th century. In fact, the Chinese immigrants who fled to Southeast Asia after the demise of the Southern Song dynasty also had a strong political attribute. However, the number of countries destroyed by the Mongols and Yuan dynasty was so large that it was hard to count them all, and the Southern Song dynasty was not missing. In addition, the Yuan dynasty existed for a short time, and the Yuan dynasty rulers had limited control over southern China. The Yuan Empire also needed to rely on maritime trade to fill its treasury, so its attitude towards the Chinese in Southeast Asia was not as vigilant and hostile as that of the Qing dynasty. The Chinese community in Southeast Asia is large enough and has enough wealth. As long as the Qing government uses it properly, it can fully exert influence in Southeast Asia. To put it another way, even if a Chinese regime in Southeast Asia survives, The planners behind the scenes of the anti-Chinese movement in later generations would at least have concerns before planning. The safety of the shipping lanes in the South China Sea and even the Strait of Malacca can be more guaranteed. Unfortunately, none of these are available. Don't you want the overseas territories that are delivered to your door? Fremont was puzzled and could not understand the train of thought of the Qing dynasty rulers. Now they are delivered to our door, do we want them? Liang Zhao asked Fremont with a smile. Fremont hesitated for a while, and after a brief thought and weighing the pros and cons, he answered very affirmatively, yes, definitely. Whether it is for tropical plantations or for gaining a strategic fulcrum in Southeast Asia, it is worth a try. Fremont, who was born as an explorer, is a very adventurous person and has a radical attitude towards overseas expansion. Fremont and Liang Zhao thought of the same thing. To obtain a base on the island of Borneo, Liang Zhao wanted not only a rubber plantation, but also a strategic fulcrum. Britain and France are strong, and the overseas colonies of these two heavyweights cannot be touched. Liang Zhao can only touch the colonies of Spain and the Netherlands. Of course, these two countries cannot be offended at the same time, otherwise Liang Zhao will not be able to bear it. Spain's current relationship with Liang Zhao can't be said to be good or bad. It can only be said to be fair and proper. If you can avoid offending them, try not to offend them. Without sufficient power, it is foolish to make enemies everywhere. If Liang Zhao is asked to choose between touching the cheese of Spain or the cheese of the Dutch, Liang Zhao will choose the Netherlands without hesitation. The Netherlands is not only inferior to Spain in national strength and size. Moreover, since Liang Zhao went to Japan to force Japan to sign the opening contract, he broke the Netherlands' trade monopoly on Japan. The Dutch have long hated Liang Zhao and even the United States. The relationship between Liang Zhao and the Dutch has long dropped to the freezing point. I think so too, Liang Zhao nodded in approval. But given the current severe domestic situation, I'm afraid Congress will not go to war with the Netherlands. Fremont pinched his chin and beard and said, "Did I say I would go to war with the Netherlands?" Liang Zhao said clearly. "This is a war between the Dutch East India Company and the Umbrella Company, not a war between America and the Netherlands. America will not easily go to war with the Netherlands, and the Netherlands will not easily go to war with America." This is Liang Zhao's judgment. Mercantilism is prevalent in the Netherlands, and most of its domestic politicians are businessmen. Businessmen tend to care about gains and losses, which is an advantage at times, but a disadvantage at times. The bottom line of the Dutch is Sumatra and Java, two islands that have been painstakingly managed for 200 years, especially Java. These two islands are the core interests of the Dutch in Southeast Asia, and Borneo is only a marginal interest of the Dutch in Southeast Asia. As long as Liang Zhao does not move Sumatra and Java immediately, the Dutch will not fight Liang Zhao regardless of gains and losses to get all their assets in Southeast Asia. In this way, Liang Zhao can control the war within a certain scale, making this war a colonial company war between the Dutch East India Company and the Umbrella Company, rather than a war between countries. Of course, Liang Zhao didn't mind if the entire United States was dragged down. At most, he couldn't monopolize the strategic fulcrum of Borneo Island after the war, and had to share a piece of the pie with the American government. Fremont sat on the sofa, took out a Havana cigar from his coat pocket and played with it in his hand. As the cigar turned in his hand, Fremont's thoughts also turned. If it is a war between companies, it can't be better. As long as it can be won, California will have a new strategic support in Southeast Asia. Although the Netherlands has declined, the Dutch East India Company has accumulated for 200 years and has strong financial resources. Are you sure you can win this war? I believe in your military talent, but the Netherlands is not Japan. After all, it is a modern country. I have prepared $11 million in gold reserves for this war. I will mobilize local dignitaries in California to join in and let them invest in Umbrella Company and become shareholders of the company, Liang Zhao said. The reason why Liang Zhao has been leaving the gold that Umbrella Company found in Australia untouched is for today. He now has enough financial resources and strength to fight a war of medium intensity and limited scale. In order to successfully enter Australia for gold mining, Liang Zhao transferred 10% of the company's shares to Australian dignitaries and 10% of the shares to the British consortium headed by the Baring family. Later, Liang Zhao gradually recovered some shares, increasing his shareholding ratio from 80% to 85%. Liang Zhao is willing to transfer some shares to local politicians and financial tycoons in California, so that umbrella company can become a colonial company for Californians. As for letting Australian dignitaries and British consortiums hold some shares, it is not a bad thing for him. Moreover, Liang Zhao can afford to lose this war. If he loses, the worst thing is to roll back to California and continue farming. It is nothing more than losing some personal prestige. The Dutch-Indonesian authorities can also afford to lose. After all, the Dutch-Indonesian authorities only partially control the island of Borneo, and the island of Borneo is not their core interest. So since Liang Zhao and the Dutch-Indonesian authorities can afford to lose, are there any forces in this war that cannot afford to lose? Of course there are. The Chinese Resistance Company on the island of Borneo is the only force that cannot afford to lose. If they lose, not only will they lose their property and interests in West Borneo, but they may also lose their lives. Chapter 383 Ideological Awareness. Collins, the chief photographer and reporter of the California Daily and the New York Evening Post, had just returned to San Francisco from interviewing at the construction site of the Pacific Railway. Liang Zhao had someone notify Collins to come to Tingtao Garden to see him. "Boss, you don't have to tell me these specifically. I'm an old journalist in California. I know what should be reported and what shouldn't be reported," Collins said. Reports and photos of railway engineers and workers building railways in the snowy Nevada mountains in the severe winter and working together to build bridges and paved roads in dangerous canyons, which are in line with California's spiritual civilization, should be praised on the front page of the newspaper. For content that is not in line with California's spiritual civilization, such as the accidental explosion of nitroglycerin that killed workers and workers protesting, we can selectively report and praise the suffering to move the people. This is what you taught me, and I remember it all, Collins. This is why you can be the chief photographer and reporter of the California Daily and the New York Evening Post. You are a very ideologically conscious person. Liang Zhao was very satisfied with Collins's awareness. Collins's photography skills and writing skills are undoubtedly first-rate, otherwise Liang Zhao would not have chosen Collins to shoot and report the Los Angeles massacre in 1850. When he went on an expedition to Japan in 1852, he chose to take Collins with him as his military reporter. However, photography skills and writing skills are not the most important reason why Liang Zhao is interested in Collins. The American media industry has always been very developed, and there is no shortage of reporters with good photography skills and first-rate copywriting skills. High ideological awareness is the most important reason why Liang Zhao is interested in Collins. Sometimes positions are more important than facts. You are right. Collins' smile was mixed with a trace of unspeakable bitterness. "You asked me to come to Tingtao Garden to take a family portrait for your family. It's a waste of talent to ask you to take a family portrait. 2 local Chinese just came from Borneo Island. You go to interview them and write an article based on the facts to be published on the front page of the California Daily and the New York Evening Post," Liang Zhao said to Collins. "Facts?" Collins felt a little different. "Yes, facts. Don't look at me like that. When did I ask you to report fake news?" Liang Zhao rolled his eyes at Collins. "Facts are the soul of news. I have also said this to you California media people, that's right. You have always only asked us to report real news and then mix personal opinions into the real news." Collins could not deny it. The news Liang Zhao asked him to report was indeed real news, but it was selectively reported and reported with inflammatory language. "After interviewing them, I need you to take some reenactment photos," Liang Zhao continued. "Reenactment?" Collins asked back. "Yes, find a few Dutch people, put them in the uniforms of the Dutch Royal East India Army, and find a few Chinese Americans in California, and let those Dutch people pretend to massacre Chinese people. I think you know what kind of photos I want." Liang Zhao thought for a while and said, "Immigrant areas also have their advantages. No matter which ethnicity Liang Zhao wants to find actors. Except for blacks, they can basically be found in California, a melting pot of races. I know that the stronger the visual impact, the better, and it should look real," Collins said. "Los Angeles is a good place, with beaches, plains, forests, deserts, and all kinds of scenery nearby, but I need some money to arrange the landscape to make the photos look more real. Funding is not a problem, as long as you can take photos that satisfy me, in the presidential office of the White House in Washington." After listening to the British ambassador's protest carelessly, Fillmore politely asked the British ambassador to leave his presidential office. Corwin, who had just been promoted to Secretary of State, shrugged helplessly at Fillmore. The British insisted on presenting Liang Zhao's crimes to you in person, and I was forced to bring him to see you. You know, whether the British are right or not, they are always persistent and very difficult to deal with. Damn it, I am the President of the United States. How to be a good President of the United States still needs the British to teach me. Fillmore's brows twisted into Sichuan character. He opened the drawer of his desk, took out a box of matches, fumbled out a match from the matchbox, lit it, and then held the burning match to light his pipe. Fillmore slowly blew out a smoke ring and continued. It is not the British turn to dictate personnel appointments in the United States. Corwin also agreed that the British ambassador asked Fillmore to remove Liang Zhao's rank of general, which was indeed a bit too much. Liang Zhao was the only general promoted by Fillmore during his tenure. Fillmore replaced Liang Zhao less than a year after taking office. Wasn't Fillmore slapping himself in the face? Among Liang Zhao's many titles, Brigadier General of the Army was the only title that Fillmore had the right to remove. The more the British asked Fillmore to replace Liang Zhao's title of general, the more Fillmore felt that his appointment was correct. Fillmore asked Liang Zhao to form the Western Brigade to be responsible for the defense of the West Coast in order to make the British and Mexicans uncomfortable, not to make them feel comfortable. The British are trying to dump opiates in California, which is worthy of our vigilance. California has already enacted legislation to list opiates as contraband. I think Congress should also enact legislation to express our attitude. The Qing dynasty is a lesson for us, Corwin said worriedly. I have also read California's report and assessment on opiates. We are not in an advantageous position in trade with Britain. If we allow the opiate trade to continue, our trade deficit with Britain will only grow, which will affect our tariff revenue. Fillmore also felt that it was necessary to legislate to list opiates as contraband. Before the Opium War, in the normal trade between the Qing dynasty and Britain, the Qing dynasty was still the party with a trade surplus. The British made a large amount of silver from the Qing dynasty flow into the hands of British merchants just by selling opiates. This move must be vigilant. General Liang has more and more ideas. It seems that he is no longer satisfied with a corner of California. He wants to set up a colonial company to set foot on the island of Borneo and extend his tentacles to Southeast Asia, Corwin said. Did Your Excellency also accept the shares of Umbrella? Fillmore knew what Corwin wanted to say. The American colonial company has been slow to do anything. As long as we don't spend the federal government's money and endorse Umbrella, it's fine to let Umbrella try Southeast Asia. America also needs a wider sky and ocean. Liang also gave Fillmore 0.8% of Umbrella's shares. Fillmore is a civilian president. After he leaves office, he needs to repay the debts he owed during his presidency. The shares of Umbrella are still very tempting to Fillmore. Anyway, it's just endorsing Umbrella, not asking the federal government to pay for the establishment of a colonial company. As for whether Umbrella can open up the situation in Southeast Asia, that is Umbrella's own business. Chapter 384 The advantage is not mine. Populism is a very dangerous thing. Especially in this era when most people do not have the ability to think rationally. Once the Dutch colonial government's atrocities against the Chinese in Borneo were announced, the entire Californian population, especially the Chinese community, exploded instantly. The headlines on the front pages of major newspapers about the Dutch Royal East India Army massacring the Chinese in Borneo and the photos of massacring local Chinese and Chinese Americans, and setting fire to Chinese huts were so glaring. Collins, an old media person in California, is indeed an experienced media person. Even the beauties in the photos are carefully selected. The Dutch Royal East India Army soldiers holding bayoneted rifles and the Dutch officers wielding sabers in the photos are actors that Collins found on the street. The Chinese elderly, weak women and children who were under the knife of the Dutch Royal East India Army were also actors selected by Collins from the Chinese immigrants waiting for resettlement in the temporary resettlement area with a salary of 30 cents a day and generous conditions of food and accommodation. Even the huts were newly built. Collins's photographs are successful, and these works have inspired the empathy of the Californian people. However, there are few Chinese who are sharp-eyed and knowledgeable and feel strange. How can these red-haired devils of the Dutch East India Company be equipped with American Springfield M1842 rifles? However, these minor issues are harmless. Many Chinese people do not know what the Dutch East India government is, let alone how to distinguish the authenticity of photos. Although many Chinese do not know what the Dutch East India Company is, they know what the Dutch are. Many Dutch and Scottish immigrants have been greeted with cordial greetings recently. Either their windows have been smashed, or they have been inexplicably surrounded by a group of Chinese and other ethnic groups who are curious when walking on the street. These Dutch and Scottish immigrants soon learned that their red hair was the culprit. Because the Chinese call the Dutch red-haired devils, red hair is how they distinguish the Dutch from other white people. Knowing the reason, the Dutch and Scottish immigrants hurried to the barber shop and asked the owner to dye their red hair into other colors, or even cut off the red hair. The barber shop's business became prosperous for a time, and the smiles of the shop owners were brighter than the blooming chrysanthemums. Some clothing store owners who saw business opportunities even sold clothes and hats with words "I am American, not Dutch" written in both Chinese and English in their stores. These clothes and hats were quickly swept away by immigrants with obvious Dutch features. Even teachers at language schools who taught Chinese were entangled by white people with obvious Dutch features as soon as they left school, asking them how to quickly explain to the Chinese whether they were Dutch. Even Jeremiah, the director of the St. Francis shipyard, couldn't help complaining to Liang Zhao that because of his Dutch identity, he had often suffered misfortunes recently. In fact, Jeremiah's ancestors immigrated to New Amsterdam, which is now New York, as early as the mid-18th century. After several generations of mixed blood, they no longer had much to do with the Netherlands and were typical Americans. But it was futile to explain these things to the irrational people. On the last day of 1853, the Huaxia Chamber of Commerce announced the suspension of all trade activities with the Dutch East India Company. Just 1 week later, the California state government also passed a bill announcing an embargo on the Dutch East India authorities until the Royal Dutch East India Army withdrew from Borneo. The next day, the California Consortium announced that the Port of San Francisco, the Port of Los Angeles, the Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, the Port of Nagasaki in Japan, and the Port of Xiangshan in China, which were operated by the California Consortium, would suspend any services to all Dutch East India companies and any merchant ships flying the Dutch flag from the moment they received the news from the headquarters. It's still the unity of the comrades in California. If the comrades on the island of Borneo could be half as united as the comrades in California, why would we be bullied to this extent by the red-haired devils and not even be able to keep a foothold? Seeing this scene, Liu Shanbang couldn't help but sigh. The unity of the comrades in California is because California has a person like Mr. Liang, but we don't have a person like Mr. Liang in Borneo. Wang Jia also sighed. In Borneo, we looked after the foreigners, but here, the foreigners looked after us. On January 15, 1854, Liang Zhao was mobilizing and deploying his own armed forces in Tsingtao Garden based on the intelligence he had collected about the Dutch Royal East India Army. According to the intelligence we have collected, the Dutch East India Authorities troops are composed of European Dutch volunteers and local indigenous soldiers. Of course, in addition to European volunteers and indigenous recruits, their troops also recruited more than 2,000 foreign mercenaries of various nationalities and other nationalities. However, the Dutch East India Authorities officer corps is composed of Dutch people. Elvis, the head of the Arizona Infantry Regiment, introduced to everyone. One thing must be emphasized, they are not completely professional soldiers. The Royal Dutch East India Army is not a military organization, but a military police organization. They play the role of police and military functions in the Dutch East Indies. According to my assessment, the cohesion of this army, which is composed of Dutch officers and Dutch expatriates, European mercenaries, and Europeans and local natives, is very problematic. Its combat effectiveness is even lower than that of the newly established Beaver Regiment. Kruger, the head of the Beaver Regiment, added. Fillmore gave Liang Zhao 4.5 regiments. At the end of 1853, in response to the excessive treatment of soldiers in the California Infantry Regiment and the mismatch between the current organization and equipment tactics, Liang Zhao organized his officer corps to reform his armed forces, that is, the Western Brigade. After the reform, 1/3 of the non-commissioned officers and half of the soldiers of the California Infantry Regiment retired and became mercenaries of the Umbrella Company. The military reform of the California Infantry Regiment left a gap in non-commissioned officers and soldiers, which was filled by the original militia. Liang Zhao served concurrently as the head of the California Infantry Regiment. The Arizona Infantry Regiment has a reasonable salary and has not changed much. It is just to adapt to the new military system of 1 regiment with 4 battalions and 1 battalion with 3 companies. The original 10 infantry companies were expanded to 12 infantry companies. The commander of the Arizona Infantry Regiment is still Colonel Elvis. The Beaver Regiment, also known as the Oregon Infantry Regiment, is a new regiment formed by recruiting California citizens with military experience from the militia of the original California Militia Regiment who were not transferred to the California Militia Regiment. At the same time, the Beaver Regiment is the only infantry regiment without actual combat experience and record among the three infantry regiments. It is recognized as the weakest infantry regiment in the Western Brigade. The commander of the Beaver Regiment is the former instructor, the current colonel of the U.S. Army, Kruger. The three infantry regiments are not the entire armed forces of the Western Brigade. In addition to the three regular infantry regiments, after the military reform, Liang Zhao also has a cavalry battalion, an artillery battalion, and an engineering battalion. Kruger said that the combat effectiveness of the Royal Netherlands East India Army is not as good as the Beaver Regiment, which is somewhat contemptuous of the Royal Netherlands East India Army. The Royal Netherlands East India Army was a colonial army established on September 14, 1814 according to the Royal Netherlands Decree, and also served as a police force. The personnel composition of the Royal Netherlands East India Army was very similar to the colonial army formed by the British East India Company in India. The basic structure was white officers from the mother country plus local indigenous soldiers. The biggest difference was that the officers of the British East India Company's colonial army were basically British, while the Netherlands, with a population of only 3 million, could not do this. In addition to accepting Dutch and Dutch expatriates, the Royal Netherlands East India Army also mainly accepted Flemish region of Belgium, located in the northern coastal area of Belgium, Germans, Swiss and French. If you can master Dutch or German, you will be given priority for recruitment. Walloons, Wallonia, Belgium, located in the southern inland area of Belgium, Arabs, and British and American nationals were prohibited from serving in the Royal Netherlands East India Army. The largest number of indigenous soldiers in the Royal Netherlands East India Army were mainly composed of Javanese, Ombuan and Manado, with Javanese being the main ones. When Liang Zhao went to Borneo, in addition to the armed forces of the Lanfang Company on Borneo Island that surrendered to the Dutch East Indies colonial authorities, the biggest enemy was the Dutch East Indies Army of the Dutch East Indies colonial government. The Dutch East Indies Army was not part of the Dutch Royal Army, but an independent army specially formed to serve in the Dutch East Indies. As for the achievements of the Dutch East Indies Army, most of them were achieved with the natives of the Indonesian archipelago, such as the Padre War from 1821 to 1845, the Java War from 1825 to 1830, and the war in 1849 to suppress the Balinese residents' resistance to colonial rule. Although the Dutch East Indies Army won these wars against the local natives in the end, they were not fought beautifully. Kruger even believed that the Dutch East Indies Army was also a talent, as it had an absolute advantage in equipment and fought back and forth with the uncivilized natives. I agree with Colonel Kruger's point of view. When the Royal Netherlands East India Army was first established, the European soldiers and the indigenous soldiers were half and half. With the support of European soldiers, the Royal Netherlands East India Army could still maintain a certain combat effectiveness. But since 1835, because the Dutch East India Company could not recruit enough European soldiers in Europe, the ratio of European soldiers to indigenous soldiers has changed from 1 to 1, 3, or even higher. Therefore, I also think that the combat effectiveness of the Royal Netherlands East India Army is constantly declining, and I am also skeptical about their combat effectiveness. Elvis agreed with Kruger's point of view and believed that the combat effectiveness of the Royal Netherlands East India Army was lower than that of the Western Brigade. The Western Brigade was an army that was built with money and bullets, and except for the Beaver Regiment, it had corresponding combat experience. If the Royal Netherlands East India Army, which was composed of Europeans and indigenous people, could not even beat the indigenous people, it would be a bit unreasonable. Strategically, we should despise the enemy, and tactically, we should take the enemy seriously. The Royal Dutch East India Army has more than 8,000 European officers and soldiers and more than 20,000 indigenous soldiers. We are still at a disadvantage in terms of manpower, Liang Zhao said. Liang Zhao was more nervous and uneasy about this military operation than when he went on the expedition to Japan. After all, the feudal soldiers of the Japanese feudal domains and the army of the Tokugawa shogunate were essentially medieval armies, and there was a generation gap between his army and his army. The Royal Dutch East India Army and the Western Brigade did not have a significant generation gap, and Liang Zhao did not have an advantage in naval power, so Liang Zhao was not sure of winning. Before fighting, it is better not to underestimate the opponent. I think we still have a certain technical advantage on land. Didn't Wang Jie and Liu Shanbang say that they still have 20,000 adult men who can be armed to participate in the battle? Fremont stood up and interjected. The gap between our naval power and that of the Dutch Indonesian authorities is too great. In order to control the war to a certain scale, the U.S. Navy will not intervene. I heard that you have a good relationship with the commander of the Qing Navy. Can you ask him to come and help? We can give him money. Let Hong Mengxian come to help. Liang Zhao shook his head. Let's not talk about whether Hong Mengxian dares to privately mobilize troops to help us. Even if he has the courage to earn this money and dares to mobilize troops to help us, the Guangdong Navy only has 6 Loach-class warships and some old-style Chinese sailing ships, so I'm afraid they can't help much. Considering the economic benefits, the Dutch East India Company doesn't have many serious warships, and the sailing warships in service are all sailing warships from the last century or even the last century. Armed merchant ships are the main force of the Dutch East India Company at sea. We still have at least 4 warships that are ironclad wood, and they are equipped with Sacramento guns. If we modify some merchant ships, tow more than a dozen Loach-class ships, and mobilize some civilian armed merchant ships, we still have a great chance of winning. Sven, who had just returned from Sven Island, rubbed his hands and said excitedly. Sven had long wanted to fight a serious naval battle. Although there had been naval battles between the United States and Japan during the expedition to Japan, the naval battles with completely asymmetric strengths were no different from target shooting at sea in Sven's view, and they were not real naval battles. More than a dozen Loach-class ships? The Anti-Smuggling Bureau has all been relegated and doesn't need to work, right? If the Anti-Smuggling Bureau doesn't work, your global shipping company will pay to support us next year. Hearing Sven's suggestion to take more than a dozen Loach-class ships to Southeast Asia to fight a naval battle, Deng Wenyu immediately jumped out to object. The Dagon Company and other resistance companies still have 7 or 8 ships that can be used, but they are smaller than your big ships. However, we know some local pirates who have always had a grudge against the Dutch East India Company. This is also a maritime force that can be won over, Liu Shanbang said. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 385 This is not my war alone. The pirates in Southeast Asia are indeed a maritime force that can be used. At this time, no matter who they are or whether their identities are glorious or not, as long as they are willing to help fight the Dutch East India Company, they have united front value. Liu Shanbang, you will contact the pirates in Southeast Asia, Liang Zhao said to Liu Shanbang. Liu Shanbang has lived in the local area for a longer time and has more contact with these pirates. It is more appropriate to let Liu Shanbang contact these pirates. To contact the pirates, you need silver, Liu Shanbang said a little embarrassedly. It is possible to let the pirates stand on their side, but this requires money, and their Dagon Company and other Chinese resistance companies have been exhausted after 4 years of war. How much money do you need to buy off these pirates? Liang Zhao asked directly. Liu Shanbang pondered for a long time and said a number, $30,000. Liu Shanbang was worried that if he said too low, the money he got would not be able to sell to the pirates, and if he said too high, Liang Zhao would not agree. I will give you $50,000, and you must make these pirates stand on our side, Liang Zhao said very happily. $50,000 is not a large amount of money for Liang Zhao. If $50,000 can win some helpers, the money will be worth it. Of course, Liang Zhao's bottom line is that these pirates are not on the side of the Dutch East India Company. Liang Zhao can accept less enemies without more helpers. With this $50,000 and your prestige, there is no need to worry about not being able to convince those pirates. Liu Shanbang was overjoyed. Although the Dutch Indies authorities have more than 28,000 soldiers, they need these soldiers to maintain order in their colonies in the East Indies, and the troops that can be withdrawn to fight us are limited. Our goal is to focus on the island of Borneo. Without the colonial burden of the Dutch Indies authorities, we are not completely without the initiative, Liang Zhao analyzed. The Dutch Indies colonial authorities have more than 28,000 troops on paper, which does not mean that they can put all their troops into the battlefield of Borneo. The role of the Royal Dutch East India Army is not only the army, but also the colonial police. If all these troops are withdrawn, the colonial order that the Dutch Indies authorities have painstakingly built in the East Indies will inevitably collapse. Abandoning the islands of Sumatra and Java, which have been firmly controlled, and investing all forces to fight for Borneo, which has not yet gained a firm foothold. Liang Zhao believes that the Dutch Indonesian authorities will not be so stupid as to do such a thing. In fact, the 4-year Lotus War on Borneo has shown that the Dutch Indonesian authorities do not have sufficient mobile forces, otherwise they would not have to win over the Lanfang Company to fight against other Chinese resistance companies, let alone spend 4 years without taking down the Chinese base in West Borneo. The Sacramento arsenal has stockpiled 66-pound Sacramento guns, 35 12-pound Sacramento guns, 10 20-pound guns, and 5 24-pound guns. In terms of light weapons, after we temporarily suspended the delivery of the French rifle order, we also stored 2,300 Walter M1851 rifles and 4,500 Walter M1851E rifles, Sutter said. There are enough cannons. As for light weapons, let the arsenal speed up production. The French order cannot be delayed for too long. The French penalty is not a small amount, Liang Zhao thought for a while and said. Collect some Springfield M1842 rifles in good condition, whether rifled or smoothbore, as long as they are in good condition and can be used. Dagon Company and other Chinese resistance companies still have more than 20,000 young and strong men under their command. Liang Zhao plans to arm the young and strong Chinese in these resistance companies. It is better to let these local young and strong men take on the heavy casualties of the offensive battle, which can also reduce the losses of the Western Brigade. Less than 7,000 Walter rifles are definitely not enough to arm more than 20,000 young and strong men. Liang Zhao can only collect some Springfield M1842 in stock and bring them together. Although Liang Zhao doesn't like these old-fashioned Springfield rifles, the active equipment of the Royal Dutch East India Army is not as good as the equipment of the current ordinary American Army. Before 1830, the military industry of the Netherlands was not backward. But the fact that the military industry of the Netherlands was not backward before 1830 was based on the premise that Belgium was within the framework of the United Provinces of the Netherlands. Rather than saying that the military industry of the Netherlands was not backward before 1830, it is better to say that the military industry of Belgium was not backward before 1830. Before 1830, the supply of weapons to the Netherlands mainly came from the Belgian Sun. In 1830, after Belgium became independent from the Netherlands due to the July Revolution in France, the weakness of the Dutch military industry became apparent. Belgium has developed industry and agriculture, while the Dutch economy focuses on commerce and fisheries. Therefore, after Belgium's independence, the Dutch could not independently manufacture guns that were not behind the world average. Of course, the inconsistency of economic structure and economic interests is also the reason why Belgium and the Netherlands eventually parted ways. After Belgium's independence, the Dutch urgently introduced production lines from abroad and established the Delft State Military Factory, which launched the first standard rifle of the Netherlands in 1848, the Model 1848 rifle. The most advanced equipment of the Royal Dutch East India Army is the Model 1848 rifle. This gun is a smoothbore rifle that uses a percussion cap to fire. It uses 17.5 mm round bullets and is also known as the first generation of Dutch bullets. In an era when Britain and France were replacing mini-A rifles or even breech-loading rifles, the 1848 rifle launched by the Dutch was obviously behind the times. However, the launch of the 1848 rifle was not meaningless. At least it proved that the Netherlands still had the ability to independently produce light weapons after Belgium's independence. In addition, this gun unified the caliber of the standard weapons of the Dutch native army and the colonial army. This was something that the Dutch authorities had never done before. "Boss, all the guests you invited are here and are waiting in the hall." When the meeting was about to end, Carnegie leaned close to Liang Zhao's ear and said to Liang Zhao, seeing that everything that should be arranged had been arranged and everything that should be explained had been explained. Liang Zhao ended the meeting and came to the reception room. He did not want to send troops to Borneo to be a war for himself alone, but hoped that it would be a colonization war for all Californians, or at least most Californians. At present, the Dagon Company and other Chinese on Borneo have not yet collapsed, and Britain and France are caught in the Crimean War, which is the best window for sending troops. If you don't seize the opportunity this time, you will have to wait for a long time to get involved in Southeast Asia in the future. These people in the reception room are not as easy to fool as ordinary people. Ordinary people can stir up their emotions with a few articles and a few photos, but these California dignitaries in the reception room cannot. Liang Zhao and Fremont, Sutter and other core military and political figures in California walked out of the conference room, and the debate in the reception room was still very intense. The topic they argued about was whether it was necessary to send troops directly to Borneo. Although Liang Zhao sent troops to Borneo in the name of hiring armed forces of the Umbrella Company, everyone with a discerning eye knew that this was Liang Zhao mobilizing the Western Brigade to go to Borneo, but it was just a cover. Of course, this is not the most concerned issue for these California upper-class people in the reception room. After all, the Western Brigade is mainly funded by Liang Zhao himself, and it is not their turn to make decisions. The only thing they could do was to ask Liang Zhao to requisition their merchant ships and ask them to organize private armed forces to accompany the army to Borneo. This made many people, especially the non-Chinese upper class in California, hesitant and weighing whether they had the need to go to Borneo. To put it bluntly, what could they get by paying for and organizing armed forces to follow Liang Zhao to Borneo? On this point, not to mention the upper class in California, even the core of the top level could not reach a complete consensus. Governor Robinson believed that California's top priority was to develop its own economy, rather than to send troops on an expedition and fight a meaningless war with the Dutch on an island tens of thousands of miles away. Chapter 386, Borneo has oil. The Dutch-Indonesian authorities did carry out an inhumane massacre of the Chinese on Borneo Island, and many Chinese Americans were also killed, but I think we can adopt a more gentle way to support the Chinese on Borneo Island, such as providing them with material assistance. Robinson did not agree to send troops directly to Borneo Island, especially to mobilize California's civilian armed forces to send troops directly to Borneo Island. Borneo Island can grow rubber trees, which is a tropical cash crop that we cannot grow in California at present. Rubber is also an indispensable raw material for our California industrialization. If we want to break the Brazilian monopoly on rubber, we can only grow it ourselves. And planting rubber requires plantations in tropical areas. We send troops not only to save our compatriots on Borneo Island, but also for the industrialization of our California. As a Chinese, Wu Yuanho firmly supports sending troops to Borneo Island. He has personally contributed 2 Baltimore clippers, also known as clipper ships. These clippers have been sent to the San Francisco shipyard to install Sacramento guns. The armed clippers will be used as maritime support forces for this military operation. The entire Huaxia Chamber of Commerce directly contributed 8 clippers for modification. The clipper originated from the American War of Independence. It was designed and manufactured by the United States during the war based on the Bermuda sailboat in order to break through the blockade of British naval forces. This ship sacrificed cargo space for extreme speed and was used to break through the blockade of British ships for material transportation and limited commercial trade. This type of ship was mainly active in the near sea in the early days, so the tonnage was also very small, generally not exceeding 200 tons, with a narrow hull, a high mast, and a large sail. Due to its extreme speed, it can easily run at a speed of 11 knots or even higher in low wind conditions. This clipper can easily shake off the pursuit of conventional sailing warships or even privateers. Moreover, its hull is small and low, and the naval guns on British ships often find it difficult to hit such high-speed moving small targets. During the War of Independence, the Baltimore shipyard manufactured a large number of such small and flexible clippers, so this ship was also called the Baltimore Clipper. After the war, countries also saw the commercial value of this clipper, which was used to carry high-value goods, such as Chinese tea and the British East India Company's Fu Show cream. In order to meet commercial needs, merchants from various countries modified and upgraded the clipper, and its tonnage soon exceeded 200 tons. The displacement of the Lynx in the early 19th century reached 223 tons. At present, the main force of merchant ships traveling between San Francisco and New York is the fast-sailing ships such as the clipper. However, its ship type is an improved ship type in the 1830s and 1940s, and its representative is the Rainbow Clipper with a displacement of 757 tons. Although the speed of the Rainbow is not as good as the early Baltimore clippers under 200 tons, it can still easily run at a speed of more than 10 knots in moderate wind conditions. This speed is already amazing for a sailing ship of this tonnage. The ship once set a record of 88 days from Guangzhou to New York, and its speed can be seen. It is worth mentioning that the first real clipper ship, Haoguan, was named after Wu Bingjian, the general merchant of Guangzhou 13 Hongs. Many designs of the Rainbow were improved on the basis of Haoguan. The reason why Liang Zhao chose to recruit clippers in good condition is also very simple. One is that clippers have fast speed and flexible steering. Coupled with the extremely fast-firing Sacramento guns, they can give full play to their advantages as clippers. As for another reason, clippers are cheap and it is not painful to lose a few. Although San Francisco also has many sailing merchant ships and even steam paddle steamers with a displacement of 1 or 2,000 tons, or even 3 or 4,000 tons. For example, Liang Zhao's own Global Shipping has many steam paddle steamers with a displacement of 2 or 3,000 tons. But these ships are too heavy, not flexible enough, and not specialized warships. The level of protection is also limited. Using these merchant ships to participate in naval battles after modification is tantamount to being a target for the warships of the Dutch East India Company. Moreover, these ships are more expensive than clippers, especially large steam and paddle steamers, which are expensive. Liang Zhao also needs to use these ships to transport immigrants from Guangdong and Fujian, and he cannot afford to lose steam and paddle steamers. Let's not talk about whether transplanting rubber from Brazil to Borneo will be successful. Even if it can be successful, as far as I know, it takes at least 8 years for rubber trees to mature, Robinson retorted. Before the rubber trees mature, we can plant safflower, which can generate profits in a short period of time. There is also a market for safflower in European countries, Pan Zhengwei said. Safflower can also be grown in Mexico and Central American countries, which are closer. Moreover, the British East India Company can also grow safflower itself, and their experience in planting and selling is richer than ours. We can completely produce and sell it ourselves. Our safflower grown on Borneo has no advantage over the safflower grown by the British East India Company, Robinson said. Then we can sell it to Japan, which is closer. Although Japan is poor, if we want to make money, we can still make some money, Wu Yuanho said. The debate between the two sides was deadlocked, and each had its own reasons. Liang Zhao smiled slightly and said lightly, "There's oil in Borneo, there's oil in Borneo?" This sentence was like a heavy bomb, and the California upper class who were debating in the reception room instantly exploded, and everyone took a breath of cold air. After seeing the oil boom in Los Angeles, they knew what oil meant. Oil is flowing liquid gold. As long as the byproducts of oil are produced, there will be no worries about not having a market. Really? Robinson looked at Liang Zhao in disbelief. When have I ever lied to you? The oil on Borneo is in Brunei. As long as we deal with the Dutch East India Company in Brunei, the oil on Borneo will be ours, Liang Zhao said with a smile. The Dutch not only massacred the Chinese, but also massacred my American compatriots. They are extremely evil. We must punish them. We must punish them. California must teach them a lesson. Let them remember it. After confirming that there was oil on Borneo, Robinson's attitude suddenly changed 180 degrees. And he no longer opposed Liang Zhao's organization of California's civilian armed forces to intervene in the Dutch-Chinese war on Borneo. Robinson looked at Liang Zhao with a bit of resentment. If he hadn't told me earlier that there was oil, I wouldn't have to argue with the Chinese businessmen about this issue. Oil made the California upper class reach a consensus, and no longer argued about whether to send troops or mobilize civilian armed forces. Cheers to save our compatriots, Liang Zhao raised his glass and said to everyone. For our compatriots. Cheers. The California upper class in the reception room raised their wine glasses and teacups and clinked them. After the California upper class reached a consensus and shared common interests, Liang Zhao made the final preparations. Before the troops move, the food and grass must go first. For expeditionary warfare, the most important thing is the logistical supply capability. The combat effectiveness of Liang Zhao's army is very dependent on logistical ammunition supply. Whether the logistics can keep up can even determine the success or failure of this war. After the order was issued, a large amount of war supplies were transported to Xiangshan, Guangdong by merchant ships. Before the port on Borneo Island was acquired, Xiangshan port was Liang Zhao's closest and most important logistical supply base. Xiangshan is the territory of the Qing dynasty. No matter how bold the Dutch are, they dare not go to war with the Qing dynasty and attack Xiangshan port. Therefore, Xiangshan, the logistics base, is still safe. At the same time, Liang Zhao wrote a letter to Hong Mingxiang with a tried attitude. If Hong Mingxiang is willing to help, it would be best. If not, let him help transport some supplies to the local Chinese resistance company on Borneo Island. More than half a month later in Guangzhou, Wu Yuanhe came to the governor's mansion to visit Hong Mingxiang with Liang Zhao's letter. After transporting a batch of canned food and sugar cubes, as well as some cotton cloth and gauze to Xiangshan, Hong Mingxiang's battalion has been equipped with Walter M1851E rifles, and the guards have a Sacramento Colt revolver on their waists. Hong Mingxiang is now also engaged in the gold mining business in Australia, and his guards are also benefiting from it, eating fat and strong. Liang Yi, a rare guest, I heard that you are doing well in America. Hearing that Wu Yuanhe was visiting, Hong Mingxiang came out to greet Wu Yuanhe in person. Thanks to Mr. Liang, without Mr. Liang, our Wu family's business can't be done in America and Europe. Wu Yuanhe smiled. Mr. Liang is really a strange man, and the Liang family is really full of talents, Hong Mingxiang sighed. In addition to Mr. Liang, is there another capable person in the Liang family? Wu Yuanhe asked curiously. Mr. Liang's fifth uncle, Liang Shaoqiang led a battalion of Guangdong warriors to defeat the attack of tens of thousands of Taiping rebels in the first battle outside Yangzhou City, and took advantage of the siege of Yangzhou City. Although the newspaper said that the 8 banner soldiers of the Jiangbei camp and the Guangdong warriors worked together to severely defeat the Taiping rebels, everyone with a discerning eye knew that the 8 banners dared not attack the Taiping rebels, Hong Mingxiang said in a low voice. Defeating 10,000 people with 1,000 men is indeed a great victory that has never been seen since the Taiping rebels started, Wu Yuanhe nodded and said. Wu Yuanhe knew how many people there were in a battalion of Guangdong warriors. When the Guangdong warriors were formed, the Jardine Matheson Bank also donated a lot of money to purchase arms and recruit local warriors. This is just the beginning. More than 2 months ago, the Guangdong warriors went on another journey and went out of the city to fight the Taiping rebels in the field. This time, they also captured the Taiping rebel leader Wei Jun alive. The emperor was very pleased and overturned the case for the Liang family, granting Liang Shaoqiang the same status as a Jinchi. Hong Mingxiang sighed as he led Wu Yuanhe to the main hall. Liang Shaoqiang's future is limitless. In that case, the Liang family has indeed produced many talented people, Wu Yuanhe sighed. After entering the main hall, Hong Mingxiang and Wu Yuanhe sat down, and the two took the tea brought by the maid. After taking a sip of tea, Wu Yuanhe explained his purpose and took out a letter from his sleeve and handed it to Hong Mingxiang. Mr. Liang wants to save the Chinese on Borneo Island, and hopes that the Huang army can help from behind. Hong Mingxiang opened the letter and read it. After reading it, he put down the letter in his hand and said very straightforwardly, Mr. Liang's affairs are Hong's affairs, and Hong has no reason to stand by and watch. Hong Mingxiang's straightforward attitude surprised Wu Yuanhe very much. Even if Liang Zhao agreed to give Hong Mingxiang $100,000 as a reward for sending troops to help, Hong Mingxiang's agreement was too straightforward. Things went smoothly, which made Wu Yuanhe feel a little unbelievable. Chapter 387 Fulcrum Operation 1854, the assembled fleet and the selected armed forces set out from San Francisco. After replenishing coal in Hawaii, they went directly to Xiangshan port in Guangdong. It was obviously impossible to complete this military operation alone with the 500 mercenaries of the Umbrella Company. Therefore, most of the armed forces of the Western Brigade went with the fleet to participate in this military operation. The regular land military forces participating in this expedition called the Fulcrum Expedition included all the California Infantry Regiment, all the Arizona Infantry Regiment, 2 battalions of the Oregon Infantry Regiment, an engineer battalion, 2 artillery companies, and a cavalry company, totaling 3,800 people. In addition to the land forces, there were also civilian armed forces organized and recruited by the upper class of California, totaling 1,300 people. These civilian armed forces were organized into a militia to assist in combat, and Fremont was responsible for command. Since this time the troops were sent out in the name of the Umbrella Company, the regular troops were prohibited from carrying their headquarters' military flags. Therefore, Each unit was equipped with a flag of the umbrella company's umbrella logo, but different symbols were painted on the flag to distinguish them. For example, the flag of the California Infantry Regiment was painted with a dragon, the flag of the Arizona Infantry Regiment was painted with a cactus, and the flag of the Oregon Infantry Regiment was painted with a beaver. In terms of maritime forces, 4 modified warships were dispatched in full force, 8 Loach-class ships of the Anti-Smuggling Bureau were requisitioned, and 16 clippers were requisitioned and modified from the civilian sector, with displacements ranging from 700 tons to 1,200 tons. These clippers were installed with 22 to 36-pound Sacramento guns as support ships according to specific circumstances. Global Shipping Company also dispatched 7 steam paddle steamers as transport ships to ensure the logistics transportation of the troops. The number of crew members participating in this military operation reached 3,400, of which 2,800 were combat personnel. This was the largest armed force ever mobilized by Liang Zhao. In order to capture the island of Borneo, Liang Zhao basically took out all the belongings he could. Liang Zhao hoped to end the war on Borneo in a short time, rather than getting bogged down in the quagmire of war, so he spent a lot of money to mobilize 9,000 people to participate in this military operation. It's a lot of money. The war hasn't started yet. Last month, the salary alone cost $250,000, and the cost of the test ammunition was a full $120,000. On the bold, Liang Zhao stared at the list of expenses since the personnel were assembled last month and cried out that it hurt. Including the purchase of materials for transportation to Xiangshan, the cost of the clipper ship modification, the fuel money for the steamship, and the money for bribery of Southeast Asian pirates and Hong Mingxiang, Liang Zhao has spent $860,000 before the war even started. I really don't know how much more money will be spent after the war starts. When the cannon is fired, gold is worth 1,000 taels. The ancients were not deceiving me. Are you heartbroken? Fremont teased. This is $860,000, Liang Zhao said, covering his chest. I hope this money is not wasted. And it won't even make a sound when thrown out. Fremont stared at the operation called fulcrum on the table and said, as long as we can land on Borneo Island, the operation plan will be half successful, and the money will be worth spending. Land operations are our strengths. After landing, the troops also need a steady supply of logistical materials. Only with sufficient ammunition can our troops exert their combat effectiveness. Liang Zhao stood up and drew 2 lines on the map. The Dutch supply line from Batavia, Jakarta, to West Borneo is only more than 700 kilometers, while our supply line from Xiangshan to West Borneo is more than 2,500 kilometers in a straight line. If you want to defeat the Dutch Indonesian authorities, even if you don't annihilate their naval forces, you have to hurt their main naval forces. In island warfare, whoever has the strongest supply capacity is the boss. If you can't get control of the sea, the officers and soldiers who land on the island will not be in a better situation than the soldiers of the Chinese resistance organization on the island. If you want to win, especially quickly, you must take control of the sea, or at least a part of it. Maritime power requires a long period of accumulation, and the gap in this area cannot be caught up in a year or two. The 2 Daring-class ships being built by the San Francisco shipyard will not be launched until July at the earliest. Before the 2 Daring-class ships are launched, Liang Zhao only has 4 serious warships available. Although the Netherlands was severely injured after the Anglo-Dutch War and has never recovered since then, its maritime power has accumulated for more than 200 years and should not be underestimated. Liang Zhao is fully confident that he can defeat the colonial army of the Dutch Indonesian authorities in land combat, but he is not sure whether he can defeat the Dutch Indonesian authorities in naval combat and obtain a part of the sea control. On February 25, 1854, Colonel Elvis of the Arizona Infantry Regiment boarded a merchant ship flying the British flag and sailed into the Kapuas River and entered the port of Pontianak with a nervous mood. Although this merchant ship was leased by the American group from the British Steamship Company in Hong Kong, the crew on it were all English, Scottish and Irish crew members of the Global Shipping Company. The control areas of the Dagon Company and other Chinese resistance companies have been squeezed out of the coast and cannot provide Liang Zhao with a port for mooring. Liang Zhao can only take a port by himself. The number of Liang Zhao's troops in this expedition is as high as 9,000. In order to satisfy the food, drink, defecation and urination of 9,000 people, he must take a port that can berth large ships. There are 2 ports suitable for landing in West Borneo. One is Sarawak in the north, and the other is Pontianak in the west. From a purely geographical point of view, Sarawak in the north seems to be a more ideal landing place. Compared with Pontianak, Sarawak is farther away from Batavia, and the ships of the Dutch Indochina authorities patrol the waters near Sarawak less frequently. But from a political point of view, Sarawak is not so suitable as a landing place. In 1842, after the British James Brooke announced that Sarawak had separated from Brunei and became an independent kingdom, the Brooke dynasty. The British authorities immediately declared the Brooke dynasty as its protectorate. Sarawak was actually a British protectorate. America also recognized the legitimacy of the Brooke dynasty in Sarawak. Liang Zhao was not stupid enough to offend the British and create another strong enemy for himself. Therefore, after comprehensive consideration, only Pontianak was the only option for Liang Zhao to choose. Although Pontianak barely maintained its independence at this time, it was controlled by Sultan Al-Qadri of the Pontianak Sultanate. But in fact, the Pontianak area was already the back garden of the Dutch Indochina authorities. Sultan Al-Qadri was just a puppet supported by the Dutch Indochina authorities. The Dutch Indochina authorities also attached great importance to Pontianak. Colonel Anderson, the general of the Dutch Royal East India Army who is responsible for destroying the Dagon Company and other Chinese resistance companies, was stationed in Pontianak. The composition of the garrison guarding Pontianak was very complex. There were not only the Dutch Royal East India Army, but also the troops of the Pontianak chiefdom and the troops of the Lan Fang Company, wearing the Qing Dynasty green camp-style military uniforms. However, due to the poor combat effectiveness of the chiefdom's troops, the core garrison force of Pontianak was actually a regiment of the Dutch East Indies Army and a Lan Fang Company armed force to assist in the defense. A lieutenant of the Dutch East Indies Army on duty at the Pontianak dock saw a foreign ship entering Pontianak and ordered Elvis to stop the ship for inspection. Chapter 388, Shit on You. Pontianak port is not a free trade port. Except for Dutch merchant ships from other countries are prohibited from entering without permission. The Dutch lieutenant on duty shouted to Elvis in English, ordering Elvis to stop the ship. As soon as the voice fell, Yi Tanghu, the former general manager of Lan Fang Company, who had been waiting at Pontianak port, said to the Dutch lieutenant, "Lieutenant Carlero, this is the goods I purchased. I hope you can help me." As he said that, Yi Tanghu took out a small 1-ounce gold nugget from his sleeve and stuffed it into Lieutenant Carlito's hand. "Your goods." Lieutenant Carlito held the gold nugget in his hand and did not express his opinion. Yi Tanghu understood, gritted his teeth, took out another 1-ounce gold nugget and stuffed it into Lieutenant Carlito's hand. Lieutenant Carlito then showed a satisfied smile and waved his hand to signal to let him go. "This is Yi Tanghu, the 9th General Manager of Lan Fang Company. General Manager Yi, we can win over the power." Wang Jia, who had a braid cut and wore Western clothes, said to Elvis. The Lan Fang Company was not a monolithic entity, and not all Lan Fang executives wanted to serve the Dutch Indonesian authorities. Elvis ordered the crew to unload the cargo as soon as possible, and then he got off the ship and shook hands with Yi Tanghu. "Hello, Mr. Yi, I'm Elvis. Your Excellency can speak Mandarin." Elvis could speak relatively fluent Chinese, which surprised Yi Tanghu. "To lead troops for Mr. Liang, you must speak Chinese." Elvis looked around and saw that no one was approaching, so he lowered his voice and said, "General Yi is willing to give up his family business in China to come out and help. Wang, on behalf of the Han people on Borneo Island, would like to thank General Yi." Wang Jia clasped his fists to thank Yi Tanghu. Ashamed, I am ashamed of the old general," Yi Tanghu sighed, his face full of guilt. "The collapse of Lan Fang started with me. I should have ended it all. I valued my business too much and neglected the management of the company, giving Liu Shaoxin, the dog trader, the opportunity to take office. I was wrong. Liu Shaoxin was originally the accountant of Lan Fang Company. Yi Tanghu saw that he was capable, fair and selfless, and had outstanding abilities. He was a rare talent. So when he left office, he recommended Liu Shaoxin to be the general manager of Lan Fang Company. I didn't want to cause today's disaster. This trip to California, Wang has a lot of feelings. The unity of Chinese in California is rare. Mr. Liang went to California to pan for gold for more than 4 years, and he led the Chinese to gain a foothold in California. The Chinese on the island of Borneo are still fighting among themselves today," Wang Jia said. The collapse of Lan Fang Company began when the 6th General Manager Liu Tauer, 1823 to 1837, sought cooperation with the Dutch Indonesian authorities without any bottom line. Ye Tenghu is also responsible for the collapse of Lanfang Company, but it is not his responsibility alone. The Lanfang Company did not understand the East India Company's tricks and applied the East India Company's organizational structure, and mixed it with the organizational management form of the Folk Party, making it a mess. In addition, there was no strong government to endorse it, and there was a lack of strong leaders with outstanding vision and ability. It was destined that the demise of the Lanfang Company was only a matter of time. How many troops did Mr. Liang lead this time? Ye Tenghu asked. I have also heard that Mr. Liang went on an expedition to Japan and defeated 100,000 enemies in one battle. If Mr. Liang sent troops to help, the Han people on Borneo would be saved. Ye Tenghu also heard about Liang Zhao's expedition to Japan, which is the favorite topic of Guangdong storytellers this year. Although word of mouth is inevitably exaggerated, it is a real fact that Liang Zhao's battle in Kanagawa forced the Japanese shogunate authorities to open the country and sign the Edo Treaty. If Liang Zhao directly sent troops to intervene in the food on West Borneo, the Chinese on Borneo might not be without the possibility of a comeback. Tens of thousands, Wang Jia gave an ambiguous number. I wonder when Mr. Liang will land? On the day Mr. Liang lands, we, the Lanfang Yuzhong, will fully cooperate. Although tens of thousands is a very vague number, it at least gave Ye Tenghu a reassurance. We will discuss the specific matters after we return, Wang Jia said. Liang Zhao's instructions to Wang Jia were to lead the Lanfang Yuzhong in Pontianak to capture the Pontianak Wharf, especially the artillery forts in Pontianak, when the Umbrella Company landed armed forces. If the Pontianak Wharf and artillery forts could not be taken, at least an armed uprising should be launched on the day of the landing to track some of the Pontianak garrison and reduce the pressure on the landing troops. After the cargo boxes on the cargo ship were unloaded, Ye Tenghu signaled his men to pull these heavy cargo boxes back to his house. These cargo boxes contained the guns and ammunition they needed for the day of the uprising. Although the Dutch Indonesian authorities used the Lanfang Company to suppress other Chinese forces in West Borneo, they always had a sense of vigilance against the Lanfang Company. The armed forces of the Lanfang Company were equipped with a certain number of firearms, but they were all old-fashioned flintlocks or even matchlocks that were eliminated by the Dutch East Indies authorities. The performance of the weapons equipped by the Lanfang Company was completely incomparable to the 1848 style percussion cap rifles that the Dutch Royal East Indies Army had just replaced. Wait, Ye Tenghu's convoy was pulling the cargo boxes away from the dock, but was blocked by a young man. Behind the young man was a group of Lanfang Company soldiers who were either holding muskets or equipped with waist knives. Oh no, it was Ye Tenghu, the dog trader. Why did this kid come to Pontianak instead of staying in Dongwonlu, the location of the Lanfang Company's headquarters? Wang Jia subconsciously pulled down his hat. Ye Tenghu is the son-in-law of Liu Shaoxin, the current general manager of the Lanfang Company. The father-in-law and son-in-law are in cahoots with each other, willing to be the dogs of the Dutch East Indies authorities, helping the Dutch East Indies authorities bully their compatriots. Uncle, I say, you old bones, why don't you stay in Guangdong and run your business honestly, and come to Borneo for what? Ye Tenghu walked up to Ye Tenghu and said with a fake smile. How can doing business make money as much as digging for gold? Ye Tenghu replied calmly. Ye Tenghu was not surprised by Ye Tenghu's appearance. This bastard had arrived in Pontianak 2 weeks ago and visited him. But he was turned away by Ye Tenghu. After learning that Ye Tenghu and the Dutch were in collusion and willing to be a running blog, Ye Tenghu had already severed the uncle-nephew relationship with Ye Tenghu. Suddenly showing goodwill to Ye Tenghu would make him suspicious. Nowadays is different from the past. In the past, we only needed to pay the share of the local Aboriginal leader. Now we have to pay not only the share of the local Aboriginal leader, but also the share of the Red Barbarians. After paying these two shares, there will be not much gold left in our hands, Ye Tenghu said meaningfully with his hands behind his back. The rebels in Luai have been attacking our mines like mad dogs these days. Borneo is not peaceful now. He didn't believe that his uncle gave up his business in Guangdong and went to West Borneo to pan for gold. He always felt that there was something else going on and something was wrong. But he couldn't tell what was wrong. It's all thanks to you two, the father-in-law and the son-in-law. If you two hadn't let the wolf in, why would we have to pay the red-haired ghost's share? Don't call me uncle, I don't have a nephew like you. Ye Tenghu pointed at Ye Tenghu's nose and cursed. You can't say that. Without us, it's hard to say whether our Lanfang mine can be preserved. Degan, Sanjiao Gao, which company doesn't stare at our Lanfang mine? Yu Tingfen walked to the cargo box casually and leaned against it. The commander-in-chief has ordered. Except for the Dutch ships, any merchant ships from other countries entering the port, no matter what goods they bring in, need to be carefully inspected. After saying this, Yu Tingfen waved his hand at the soldiers behind him, signaling them to pry open the cargo boxes. You bastard. Yu Tingfen. Are you going to pry open your uncle's coffin? Seeing this, Yu Tenghu was furious and pointed at Yu Tingfen's nose and cursed. Uncle, I am also following orders. Please forgive me for any offense. I hope you can understand my difficulties. Yu Tingfen pretended to apologize to Yu Tenghu. Chapter 389 Ultimatum. When Yu Tingfen's men used crowbars to pry open the wooden cargo box, Elvis and Wang's hands had already reached to their waists involuntarily, preparing for the worst. Yu Tingfen pulled away the straw on the upper layer, and what came into view was a brand new steam engine. The foreign code on it was clearly printed, "Made in California." This is California goods. Why is your cargo ship flying the British flag? Yu Tingfang asked vigilantly. Sir, California and the Dutch East Indies are under mutual embargo. If the Dutch East Indies want to buy goods from California, they can only do so through a third country, Elvis answered with reason. Elvis's answer dispelled Yu Tingfen's doubts. Indeed, now the Dutch East Indies can only buy goods from California through a third country. As for why Yu Tenghu bought steam engines and other gold mining equipment from California, the reason was also very simple. California's gold mining industry chain is relatively mature, and the gold mining tools produced in California are very popular among miners. As far as he knows, even the gold mines in Australia use gold mining tools produced in California. Yu Tingfen still gave Yu Tenghu face and opened another wooden cargo box. Seeing that it was still a steam engine, he waved his hand to let it go. Yu Tenghu snorted coldly and pulled the goods to the mine. After Liang Zhao arrived in Xiangshan, the reaction of the governor of Guangzhou was far less intense than the last time Liang Zhao came to Xiangshan. Su Guangjin and Yu Mingchen both said that Liang Zhao was only temporarily resting in Xiangshan and would not rashly go deep into the hinterland of Guangdong. Of course, even if Liang Zhao really wanted to deploy troops under the city of Guangzhou, they would not be able to do anything to Liang Zhao. Liang Zhao issued an ultimatum to the Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies, Sir Albertus Jacobus de Mar van Teves, in the name of Umbrella Company. In the letter, Liang Zhao claimed that he had obtained evidence of crimes against humanity committed by the Dutch East Indies authorities in the East Indies, and asked Teves to stop all criminal acts against humanity and stop the massacre of Chinese and indigenous peoples on the island of Borneo, especially Chinese Americans. At the end of the letter, Liang Zhao asked the Indian authorities to withdraw troops from Borneo Island, apologize to the Qing and American governments for the Dutch Indian authorities' massacre of local people, and give corresponding compensation. After receiving Liang Zhao's letter, the 45-year-old Tevez was angry and amused. He had never seen such an outrageous ultimatum. The Dutch Indian authorities massacred natives and Chinese in the East Indies. What did it have to do with Liang Zhao? This American general was too lenient. Tevez certainly would not agree to Liang Zhao's conditions. He quickly rode back to reprimand Liang Zhao for his greed and rudeness, and warned Liang Zhao not to be whimsical and try to get involved in the East Indies. Liang Zhao was waiting for Tevez's rejection letter. As soon as the Dutch Indian governor's reply arrived, Liang Zhao gathered the team and set off from Xiangshan to Borneo. "Don't leave some reserves?" Fremont asked before boarding the ship. Fremont felt that it was too reckless to go all in. The maritime force that Liang Zhao now controlled was already the limit of California's mobilization capacity. If he lost, and lost badly, California would not be able to organize a large-scale maritime force for a long time. Our paper strength at sea is not as good as that of the Dutch Indonesian authorities. Instead of being timid and keeping a reserve team to preserve our strength, it is better to fight to decide the outcome and take Pontianak directly, Liang Zhao said. If strength and conditions allow, Liang Zhao would certainly want to keep a reserve team in case of an emergency. At present, Liang Zhao's maritime strength is not dominant. Keeping a reserve team will only widen the gap between his maritime strength and that of the Dutch Indonesian authorities. If he loses the first battle, what can he do with the reserve team he left behind? The ships of the Guangdong Navy also removed any flags that could highlight the identity of the Qing dynasty at Huangpu and sailed to Xiangshan port to meet Liang Zhao. In addition to the three Loach-class ships, the most commonly equipped ships of the Guangdong Navy are rice boats, Tongan shuttle ships, and large horizontal ocean shuttles. The rice boat was originally a civilian transport ship famous for its fast speed and sturdy hull. The largest rice boat was only 95 feet, 31.67 meters, long and 20.6 feet, 6.87 meters, wide. The situation of the Tongan shuttle boat and the large horizontal ocean shuttle boat was not much better. The dimensions of the Tongan shuttle boat were 72 feet, 24 meters, long and 19 feet, 6.33 meters, wide. The large horizontal ocean shuttle boat was 82 feet, 27.33 meters, long and 26 feet, 8.67 meters, wide. The tonnage of these ships was only 200 tons, and there were only a few old guns on board. The firing conditions of these mini-boats were also very harsh. They could only hit the enemy ships when the wind and sea were calm. Otherwise, they would just hear the noise. According to the British Royal Navy ship classification standards published by the British Navy in 1817, the number of guns in the British Royal Navy's lowest level 6th class ships, such small gunboats, is between 20 and 24, the shortest length is 38.1 meters, and the minimum displacement is 450 tons. In other words, if the 6th class ships of Great Britain are placed in the Guangdong Navy, they are all treasures that can be used as flagships. Even though Liang Zhao was mentally prepared, the poverty of the Guangdong Navy still surprised Liang Zhao. What kind of ships are these? Except for the Loach-class ships, it is impossible to find a ship with a displacement of more than 300 tons. Such ships are not only difficult to sail in the ocean, but also difficult to defend near the coast. Maybe even the ships of Southeast Asian pirates are better than those of the Guangdong Navy. The Guangdong Navy was already the most impressive navy of the Qing dynasty before the westernization movement. The only consolation is that Hong Mengxiang went to war in the name of suppressing pirates, and Su Guangjin and Yi Mingchen did not object. Sun Yi knew that Hong Mengxiang was taking the Guangdong Navy to go out to sea with Liang Zhao to earn extra money, so they turned a blind eye. Does the Guangdong Navy have no bigger ships? The moment Liang Zhao saw the Guangdong Navy's fleet setting out, he instantly felt that he had given too much $100,000 and it was a huge loss. In the current situation of the Guangdong Navy, at most it can only be used as an atmosphere group to liven up the atmosphere. These are already the essence of the Guangdong Navy, Hong Mengxiang said with a dry cough. Liang Zhao was silent after hearing this and had to order the voyage. Not long after the fleet sailed out, a third-class fleet of the British Far East Fleet flying the Union Jack was seen following Liang Zhao's fleet, paying attention to every move of Liang Zhao's fleet. The third British governor of Hong Kong, Sir James, learned about the changes in Borneo Road through the mouth of Sir James of the Brooke dynasty. He was very interested in whether Liang Zhao could subvert the ruling position of the Dutch Indonesian authorities on the island of Borneo. Liang Zhao ignored the British. The British in Hong Kong did not respond to the various actions of the Dutch Indies authorities, which showed that the Hong Kong British authorities had no intention of intervening in the dispute between Liang Zhao and the Dutch Indies authorities. Of course, from another level, it can also be understood that the Hong Kong British authorities, like the Dutch Indies authorities, did not take Liang Zhao seriously at all, and believed that Liang Zhao's strength was not enough to change the current power structure in the East Indies. Chapter 390 Evacuation or War. Liang Zhao joined forces with the pirates in the South China Sea and Southeast Asia, and then headed south to the waters near Pontianak. With such a large-scale fleet, it was natural that it could not escape the eyes and ears of the Dutch Indonesian authorities. After learning of Liang Zhao's intention, Teves ordered General Cruzen to immediately organize a fleet to intercept Liang Zhao's fleet in the waters near Pontianak and prevent Liang Zhao from landing in West Borneo. Even the Dutch armed merchant ships anchored in the port of Batavia were directly requisitioned by the Dutch Indonesian authorities. Madman, just a madman. Is it the American government that endorses him behind the scenes, or is he just being daring? Teves was incredulous and angry about Liang Zhao's series of incredible actions. After reading the intelligence sent back, Cruzen's face gradually became solemn. 4 modern steamships of more than 1,000 tons, one of which is the most advanced arc-wheel warship. This is a maritime force that cannot be underestimated. After the Anglo-Dutch War, the Netherlands' national strength declined, and the independence of Belgium in 1830 severely damaged the Netherlands. At this time, the Netherlands' national strength was not as strong as before. It was just trying to maintain the dignity of the tail-end powers and was the weakest link among the powers. Tévez's intensive mobilization finally gathered 9 sailing warships, one of which was the 3-deck Rotterdam with a displacement of up to 2,300 tons and 95 guns. This was the only remaining second-class ship of the Dutch-Indonesian authorities and the last card of the Dutch-Indonesian authorities. However, the Rotterdam was built in the late 20th century and the hull is a bit old. The remaining 8 sailing warships are 4th class, 5th class and 6th class ships with a displacement ranging from 400 tons to 1,500 tons and 20 to 60 guns. Like the Rotterdam, these sailing warships are relatively old and the condition of the ships is worrying. Does the Dutch-Indonesian authorities have new ships? Yes, after all, the Netherlands was once the coachman of the sea. The emergence of steam warships also made the Dutch people of insight feel that steam warships that are not bound by wind power will be the future of the Navy. Since 1848, the Dutch have begun to concentrate their financial and material resources to develop their own new generation of steam warships. The result of the Dutch is the Sombing, a volcano on Java Island. I don't know how to translate it. If you know, please add it and I will modify it into Chinese. The Sombing is a 3-masted steam paddle steamer, which uses steam power and sail power. It has a displacement of 781 tons, a power of 110 kilowatts, a length of 66.8 meters, and is equipped with a single-cylinder coal-fired steam engine and 6 front-haul cannons. It is one of the most advanced steamships in the world. Historically, in order to promote Japan's opening to the Netherlands, after the Black Ship incident, Japan opened its country. Under the lobbying of Hendrik, the president of the Netherlands Trade Association with Japan, William III of the Netherlands agreed to send a steamship as a gift to the Tokugawa shogunate. Of course, the Dutch were not doing charity. Their real purpose was to make Japan further open its market to them in order to earn more commercial benefits. Hendrik also considered that if the ship was ordered from the Netherlands, the construction period would be very long, and the Sombing, which was serving in the Dutch East Indies, was a new ship that had just been commissioned in 1853. Therefore, under Hendrik's matchmaking, the Dutch authorities directly gave the Sombing to the Japanese shogunate. The Japanese shogunate named it Kanko-Maru, which was the first steam battleship of the Japanese Navy. Later, as a training ship, it cultivated the first generation of naval talents for the Japanese Navy. Sir, with all due respect, the current naval forces we can mobilize are limited. I request to postpone the transfer of the Sombing to the shogunate authorities. Cruzen requested to use the Sombing to strengthen the fleet. Anyway, the Japanese shogunate did not pay for the ship. Just like in another time and space, after the founding of Japan, Japan began to seek cooperation with Western countries, hoping to obtain advanced steam battleships from Western countries. The Netherlands and Japan have a long history of trade cooperation, and the Japanese have a good impression of the Dutch, so Japan is more inclined to cooperate with the Dutch. It is a stereotype that the modern Japanese Navy took Britain as its teacher. In fact, the Japanese Navy first took the Netherlands as its teacher. After the Kanko-Maru, not only the Kanko-Maru arrived in Nagasaki, Japan, but also the instructors of the Royal Netherlands Navy. It was not until the Iwakura mission visited Europe and carefully investigated European countries that it learned that the Netherlands was just a second-rate country and Britain was the first naval power. Japan soon gave up learning from the Dutch Navy and turned to the Navy to learn from Britain. The Sombing is a gift from His Majesty personally ordered to the Japanese shogunate. If it is requisitioned rashly, it may affect the friendship between the Netherlands and Japan. The Sombing was a gift from the Dutch King William II personally ordered to the Japanese shogunate. Tévez was undecided for a while. Sir, is the friendship between the Netherlands and Japan more important or our interests in the East Indies? Cruzen asked Tévez a soul-searching question. This is not a very difficult question to answer. The friendship between the Netherlands and Japan is virtual, but the interests of the Netherlands in the East Indies are real. The East Indies is the most important overseas colony of the Netherlands and the last fig leaf. There is no room for error. The Sombing is at your disposal. Tévez made up his mind. After obtaining Tévez's permission, Cruzen transferred the Kanko-Maru. The East Indies fleet, consisting of 9 warships and 18 armed merchant ships, sailed to Pontianak to assist the Pontianak garrison in defending Pontianak and the benefits gained by the Dutch Indian authorities on the island of Borneo. Under Cruzen's leadership, the East Indies fleet cruised at a speed of 8 knots and headed to Pontianak. In the waters near Pontianak, Cruzen met a huge fleet, which was Liang Zhao's fleet, and it could also be said to be Liang Zhao's entire family. Liang Zhao has 4 steam warships with a displacement of more than 1,000 tons and 11 Loach-class ships. Among these 11 Loach-class ships, Liang Zhao's own 8 Loach-class ships have been replaced with Sacramento guns. And the 3 Loach-class ships of the Guangdong Navy are still equipped with old-fashioned muzzle-loading cannons. In terms of sailing ships, Liang Zhao has 16 clippers with a displacement ranging from 700 tons to 1,200 tons, equipped with 22 to 36-pound Sacramento guns. The rest is the atmosphere group composed of small sampans of the Guangdong Navy and Southeast Asian pirates. The 2 fleets met on a narrow road at sea and confronted each other. But in terms of number and momentum, Liang Zhao, who came out in full force, is obviously better. This sea area belongs to us, the Netherlands. You have entered the Dutch waters, and you have 10 minutes to consider whether to choose to evacuate our waters or go to war. Cruzen also issued an ultimatum to Liang Zhao, requiring Liang Zhao's fleet to evacuate the waters near Pontianak. At the same time as issuing the ultimatum, Cruzen had already sent out flag signals, ordering all ships to seize the upwind direction so as to obtain a strong maneuvering position after the war. Cruzen's East Indies fleet had a low steam rate, and only 1 Sombing and 2 steamed old sailing warships could fight without the help of wind. The rest of the ships were still sailing warships, and he had to follow the combat rules of the sail era to give full play to the maximum advantage of his warships. The so-called upwind and downwind are not the same as the wind and the headwind. Instead, in the wind direction perpendicular to the direction of the sailing warship, the one above the vertical wind direction is the upwind direction, and the one below is the downwind direction. The upwind direction and the downwind direction have their own advantages. In short, the advantage of the upwind side is that it is easy to gain a maneuvering advantage, and the disadvantage is also obvious, that is, it may lose the firepower advantage. In the warships of the sail era, the waterline of the lower deck is very low, and the deck gun layout rule of each deck of the sailing warship is that the lower the deck, the stronger the firepower of the guns is than the upper deck. Taking the second-class battleship Christian as an example, the lowest level of the naval guns are 28 42-pound guns, the upper level is 28 24-pound guns, and the top is 26 12-pound guns. The lower level of the guns is the main firepower output of the sailing warship. If it is in the upwind direction, the tilt of the hull can easily cause the seawater to flood the lower and even upper decks in the direction of the enemy, resulting in only the top deck with the weakest firepower being able to fire. On the contrary, although the enemy's ships will also tilt under the action of wind, the muzzles pointing to the upper wind direction, that is, the muzzles pointing to the direction of their own ships, are basically not affected by wind and waves, so the enemy can ensure the maximum firepower output. In the sail era, the navies of various countries had different regulations on whether to seize the upper wind or the lower wind during the battle. A general rule is that naval powers tend to seize the upper wind to gain the greatest maneuverability advantage and strive for the initiative on the battlefield. Countries with relatively weak naval power tend to seize the lower wind and wait for the enemy to tire themselves out. The British Navy and the Dutch Navy are representatives who like to seize the upper wind. The French Navy, which was relatively weak in maritime power, preferred to wait in the leeward position when fighting with the British Navy. Because of the difference in the quality of sailors between the British and French navies, after the French Navy's gunners fired a round of salvos, the British Navy's gunners could often fire 3 or even more rounds of salvos. The difference in the quality of sailors made up for the British Navy's loss of firepower output in the upwind position. Therefore, in naval battles, the British Navy tended to seize the upper hand, gain mobility advantages, and strive for the initiative on the battlefield. The French Navy, on the contrary, generally did not like to seize the upper wind direction and fired at the British Navy at the loss of its main firepower output. Of course, strength is also relative. Facing the British Navy, the French Navy liked to fight in the leeward position, but when facing an opponent with weaker maritime strength than itself, the French Navy would also take the initiative to seize the upper hand. When fighting with the Spanish Navy, the French Navy often went against the norm and seized the upper wind position in the battle to obtain a rare mobility advantage to engage in battle. Wind direction was only a factor that could determine the outcome of naval battles in the sail era, not a decisive factor. The commander's decision, strength comparison, equipment level, sailors' morale, combat experience and tactical qualities, and even accidents can all become factors that determine the outcome of a naval battle. Chapter 391 Fight. The Dutch are trying to gain the upper hand, a crew member on the Bold shouted. This was Liang Zhao's first serious naval battle. He had no previous experience in naval battles, and his understanding of the Dutch's maritime strength and combat habits was still based on the intelligence he had collected. Liang Zhao didn't know whether his crew preferred to fight in the upper wind or the lower wind. But he knew one thing, that is, he couldn't let the Dutch get the position they liked, and let the Dutch fight in the wind direction they were better at. Fight the upper wind with the Dutch? Liang Zhao issued an order to fight the upper wind with the Dutch. Liang Zhao's 4 main battleships and 11 Loach-class ships were all steam ships. His fleet had a relatively high steam rate, and the wind direction had relatively little impact on them. But there were still 16 clippers and the Guangdong Navy. The pirate ships were sailing ships, and these ships still relied heavily on the wind direction to fight. Liang Zhao's goal was simple. Except for the 4 main warships in his fleet, the rest of the ships were amateur navies. The training level was relatively low, and the degree of running-in was not satisfactory. Liang Zhao's biggest advantage lies in the technical advantage of ships, or in other words, the advantage of naval guns. Liang Zhao hopes that his fleet can maintain the simplest one-line formation, use the advantage of naval guns to shoot at the opponent, and fight a line battle at sea. Don't play those fancy tactics. The Dutch sailors have good sailing skills. They skillfully manipulate the sails to maximize the use of wind power. Liang Zhao's fleet is lined up in a row. Although it has the blessing of steamships, it can only barely keep up with the Dutch ships and compete with them for the upper wind position. Obviously, the sailing skills of the merchant ship crews recruited by Liang Zhao cannot be compared with the skilled sailors of the Dutch. Seeing that the Dutch exposed themselves to the firing range of Liang Zhao's fleet in order to maneuver to an effective position. At this time, the bow of the Dutch ship was facing the side of Liang Zhao's fleet, which was an excellent window for Liang Zhao's fleet to fire. Fire! Liang Zhao gave the order to fire without hesitation. The guns on the Bold were preloaded with solid bullets. After receiving Liang Zhao's order, the two 127mm, 5-inch, main guns at the bow and stern of the Bold, and the 376mm, 3-inch, secondary guns on one side aimed at a double-deck 4th-tier sailing warship that was turning and maneuvering, and poured out the preloaded solid bullets. With the sound of the guns that came into the ears one by one, 5 solid bullets broke through the air and flew towards the enemy ship. Except for one secondary gun that missed because the gunner was too nervous, the other 2 main guns and 2 secondary guns hit the 4th-tier ship. For a moment, wood chips flew all over the 4th-tier ship that was hit. The enemy fired at our Agamemnon. General, please give orders, the officer on the Dutch flagship Rotterdam asked Cruzen to give orders. And planned maneuver to the predetermined position. Cruzen just replied lightly. He had confidence in his crew, and he believed that not only the Agamemnon battleship, but also other battleships could withstand 2 or 3 rounds of enemy bombardment. As long as they could withstand 2 or 3 rounds of artillery fire from the opponent, they can maneuver to a downwind position, and use the advantage of wind power to directly attack the opponent's formation and disperse the opponent's formation. In the competition for the upwind direction, Cruzen has keenly noticed that the quality of the opponent's crew is not as good as his own. As long as the opponent's formation is dispersed, he is sure to use the advantage of the higher quality of his own crew to defeat the opponent one by one. The Dutch East India Fleet is not rich, and Cruzen has no intention of competing with Liang Zhao at sea to compete in consumption. Their family background cannot withstand such consumption. After the Bold opened fire, the other ships also opened fire on the maneuvering Dutch warships in turn. It's just that Liang Zhao's fleet is mostly small boats, and the small boats are basically equipped with 6-pound guns. Because the guns are small, the damage to the hull caused by solid bullets is very limited, even if they hit the target. Only the naval guns on the 4 main warships caused considerable damage to the opponent's ships. The Roland, commanded by Sven, pierced a double-deck 5th-class sailing warship below the waterline with only 2 rounds of bombardment. Seawater quickly poured into the 5th-class sailing warship. The Dutch crew on the ship were busy draining water and blocking the water inlet. The 700-ton 5th-class sailing warship was paralyzed in place and temporarily lost its combat effectiveness. This was the greatest achievement of Liang Zhao's fleet in the first 2 rounds of bombardment. The Dutch's calmness and endurance made Liang Zhao uneasy. Liang Zhao's fleet had completed at least 2 rounds of bombardment. The Dutch seemed to be very patient and had not yet started to fire back. Switch to explosive bombs. Wash their decks, Seeing that the small caliber solid bullets caused very limited damage to the enemy ship's hull, hitting the enemy ship was like scraping, Liang Zhao then ordered to switch to explosive bombs and focus on killing the enemy's living forces. The performance of the crew of Liang Zhao's fleet surprised Cruzan. Cruzan originally thought that his ships only needed to withstand 2 or 3 rounds of salvos from the other side. Unexpectedly, the other side has already started the 6th round of artillery fire. What is going on? The level of the other side's sail and rigging hands, helmsmen and gunners is obviously not at the same level. The skills of the sail and rigging hands and helmsmen are very poor, and driving a small boat of the same level can only barely keep up with his maneuvers. However, the other side's gunners have an amazing reloading speed and very high shooting accuracy. This is the first time Cruzan has encountered such a situation. The firing rate of the other side's naval guns is really too fast, so fast that it is outrageous. After withstanding the 7 rounds of artillery fire from Liang Zhao's fleet, the East Indies fleet finally seized a downwind position and used the wind advantage to attack Liang Zhao's fleet, trying to break up Liang Zhao's fleet's formation. After all, it was once a maritime power. The tactical literacy of the Dutch sailors is really high. Fremont, who was watching the battle with Liang Zhao on the Bold, couldn't help but sigh. The quality of the Dutch crew can be seen from the fact that they can coordinate and orderly complete their maneuvers under the bombardment of their own artillery and seize a favorable position. Fremont subconsciously compared these Dutch crews with the crews of the American Navy, imagining whether the American Navy could perform as well as the Dutch in such a situation. Fremont's answer was no, the crews of the American Navy did not have such high tactical literacy as the Dutch crews. To obtain a favorable wind by maneuvering in the upwind position, and then using the advantage of maneuvering to break up the enemy fleet's formation, this was a trick the Dutch Navy used in the Anglo-Dutch War. Although Liang Zhao saw the trick of the Dutch, he was helpless against the oncoming attack of the Dutch. After all, Liang Zhao's organized fleet was not a professional navy. Except for the crews on the 4 main warships, the crews on the other ships, especially the clippers, were of average quality. At least the crews were lower than the other side. Seeing the Dutch ships rushing up from the side, the clippers, as well as the Guangdong Navy and the pirates' small boats, subconsciously avoided them to avoid the collision of the Dutch ships. Soon, the Dutch ships disrupted the formation of Liang Zhao's fleet. Liang Zhao tried to use the technical advantages of his own naval guns to maintain the simplest line formation, connecting head to tail, and exchange fire with the ships of the Dutch East India Fleet, but his plan failed. Liang Zhao's naval forces were not as well trained as the land forces. Once the formation was broken up, they could only fight on their own. With the training level and running-in degree of his naval forces, and the simple communication methods of the time, it was impossible to reassemble the formation in the battle. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 392, Battle at Sea. Now it was the Dutch's turn to fire at them. There were no big waves on the sea at this time, and the ship's posture was relatively stable, which was very conducive to shooting and aiming. The Dutch sailors began to retract the sails to stabilize the ship's posture, and the gunners aimed the muzzles at the sails and masts of Liang Zhao's fleet, and then pulled the cannon and fired. It must be admitted that the crew of the Dutch East India Fleet cooperated very well and executed orders very efficiently. The first round of the Dutch artillery fire was actually chain bullets. This was unexpected by many crew members of Liang Zhao's fleet. Hundreds of chain bullets were sprayed out from the muzzles and swept towards the snow-white sails. The sails that were hit were quickly torn into pieces by the Dutch chain bullets, and there were air leaks everywhere. The power of a sailboat comes from the sail, and the sail is the engine of the sailboat. The Dutch's purpose of hitting the sails is self-evident. They hope to damage the sails and even the masts of Liang Zhao's fleet, paralyze their power systems, and then catch the blind spots of these sailing ships that have lost their maneuverability, use these sailing ships as target ships, and then eat these sailing ships. The Dutch gunners' artillery skills are very superb. After 2 rounds of shooting, the mast of a clipper ship was even directly broken by the Dutch. The broken mast tore the ropes and fell down like a big tree cut down by a lumberjack, and fell into the sea. Liang Zhao secretly rejoiced that his fleet had enough steamships. The 4 main warships and 11 Loach-class ships were all steamships. This tactic of the Dutch was not effective for all the ships in Liang Zhao's fleet. If Liang Zhao was leading a pure sailing team at this time, the victory or defeat might have been seen. The technical advantage also brought Liang Zhao a higher tolerance rate. The Dutch's maritime strength should not be underestimated. The crew of the colonial fleet has such a high tactical quality. Of course, the Dutch bombardment was not easy. The Sacramento guns had a very fast firing rate, especially the naval guns on Liang Zhao's ships were still 6-pound small guns. Although the power was not good, the firing rate was amazing. After each round of bombardment by the Dutch, the clipper and loach boats could often fire at least 3 rounds of bombardment. With the technical advantages of naval guns, Liang Zhao's fleet temporarily had a slight advantage over the Dutch East Indies fleet in the artillery battle. In the distance, the British governor of Hong Kong, Bonham, observed this naval battle at the turn of the sail age and the steam age from afar. Major newspapers in Europe spread the rumor that this Sinop battle between the Russian Empire's Black Sea Fleet and the Ottoman Empire fleet, which broke out on the Black Sea in November last year, would be the last swan song of sailing warships. The naval battle that broke out in front of him now was also a rare duel between the cutting-edge steam warships and the old sailing warships. As a former rival of the British Empire, the Netherlands still had remarkable maritime strength. This new force rising on the west coast of the United States was able to fight back and forth with the East Indies fleet of the Dutch Indies Colonial Authority, which surprised Wen Xian a little. Although Liang Zhao's fleet performed well, in Wen Xian's view, it was still a group of naval rookies. Liang Zhao's fleet had relatively low organizational ability and tactical literacy. If it were not for the technical advantage of having more steamships, Liang Zhao's fleet would probably have raised the white flag or slipped away. If it were the British Royal Navy's crew to fight this naval battle, the Dutch would not be able to maintain a situation of equal strength with this fleet, and they might not even be able to seize the upper hands in the first round. Liang Zhao's maritime force still lacked actual combat experience after all. The most embarrassing thing at this time was the Guangdong Navy and pirates who came to show off their strength and support the scene. They couldn't compete with the Dutch in terms of mobility, and they couldn't compete even more in terms of artillery. Apart from the 3 Loach-class boats, the rest of the Guangdong Navy's small sampans, which were older than Hong Mengxiang, could withstand 1 or 2 rounds of bombardment from the Dutch. General, we are just here to show off, there is no need to fight to the death. The brutality of the naval battle had exceeded the imagination of the officers and soldiers of the Guangdong Navy. Hong Mengxiang's deputy Admiral Kang Yan suggested that Hong Mengxiang withdraw from the battlefield to preserve his strength. What the hell? Liang Zhao still owes us the final payment of $50,000. If I withdraw now, how can I have the face to ask Liang Zhao for the final payment later? The pirates didn't run away, but our officers and soldiers ran first. You can afford to lose this man, but I can't. Anyone who dares to talk about retreat will be shot on the spot. Hong Mengxiang picked up the Colt revolver at his waist and shouted. Guangdong Navy, listen up. All ships, approach the Red Devil's ships, prepare the grappling hooks, and prepare to board the ships. I haven't robbed the Red Devil's ship yet, so I'll rob one today. The first one to board will be rewarded with 200 taels of silver and 30 acres of paddy fields. Follow me. After saying this, Hong Mengxiang commanded the Guangdong Navy ships to rush towards the nearby Dutch ships. He wanted to hold off as many ships as possible, which was the only thing Hong Mengxiang could do for Liang Zhao at the moment. As for whether he could win, it still depended on Liang Zhao. After all, his Guangdong Navy was only a supporting role. Liang Zhao was the protagonist of this naval battle. When the pirates saw the Guangdong Navy boarding the ships, they also locked onto the nearby Dutch armed merchant ships, prepared the grappling hooks, and prepared to rush up and fight the Dutch. This was not because they were very loyal, but Liang Zhao also owed them the final payment, and they were waiting to settle the final payment with Liang Zhao after the war. The sound of cannons on the Sea of Java was endless, and the smoke was filled with gunpowder. From the time the Bold fired the first shot to now, the two sides have been engaged in a 50-minute artillery battle. Both sides suffered heavy losses. A 5th-class Dutch sailing warship was sunk, which was the only Dutch sailing warship Liang Zhao had sunk so far. The sunken sailing warship was the Agamemnon, which was paralyzed in place after Roland penetrated below the waterline at the beginning of the war and lost its maneuverability. In addition to the Agamemnon, the Dutch also sank 2 armed merchant ships. Liang Zhao had a Loach-class ship that was sunk by the opponent's flagship Rotterdam, and another ship was penetrated below the waterline and was about to sink. The losses of the clippers were even greater. The Dutch directly sank 3 clippers, and the masts of 2 clippers were hit by the Dutch, leaving only one, basically losing their power source. The 3 Dutch armed merchant ships are continuing to besiege the bombardier's 2 powerless clippers, and it is only a matter of time before these 2 clippers sink. Fortunately, Liang Zhao's 4 main warships, because of the iron sheet wrapped on the hull, withstood the Dutch's multiple rounds of shooting, did not suffer fatal injuries, and were able to continue fighting. As long as these 4 main warships can continue to fight, Liang Zhao still has hope of victory. Although Liang Zhao can afford to lose this naval battle, he does not want to lose. Once he loses, he will not be able to organize a decent maritime force in the short term to seize the sea control in Southeast Asia and project his land power to Borneo. Once the Chinese resistance forces on Borneo are eliminated by the Dutch-Indonesian authorities, it will be difficult for Liang Zhao to get involved in the East Indies. Although the exchange ratio is ugly and completely beyond Liang Zhao's expectations before the war, Liang Zhao believes that the Dutch East India fleet is not easy to fight, and the casualties are not necessarily smaller than his own. The shells fired by Liang Zhao's fleet are mainly explosive bombs, which are more inclined to kill the enemy's living forces in order to achieve the purpose of reducing the combat effectiveness of the enemy ships, rather than directly sinking the enemy ships. 300 or 400 meters away, a double-deck, 5th-class sailing warship of the Dutch East India Fleet maneuvered to the firing position, exposing its belly to the Bold, and the ship's guns fired at the side of the Bold in turn, trying to penetrate the side of the Bold. The Dutch gunners' gunnery was very accurate. The 5th-class sailing warship that fired at the Bold fired a total of 19 shots, 15 of which hit the side of the Bold. Fortunately, the side of the Bold was wrapped in cast iron, and the exposed wooden hull area was very small. Most of the shells fired by the guns of the 5th-class sailing warship hit the cast iron armor of the Bold, and did not cause much damage to the Bold. The deputy gunner on the Bold quickly responded, and 3 76mm secondary guns quickly fired a torrential rain of metal bullets at the double-deck sailing warship that had exposed its belly. The side of the 5th-class ship was soon smashed by the 3 secondary guns on the Bold along the gun window, leaving a large hole with a diameter of more than 1 meter. Why are you shooting at the gun windows? You're shooting below the waterline with your belly exposed. You idiots! The gunner ran over from the main gun's turret and hit a deputy gunner's shoulder with the scabbard of his saber. Seeing that they missed the opportunity to shoot at the enemy ship below the waterline, he cursed these deputy gunners as idiots. The enemy had exposed the hull below the waterline, but these green hands didn't directly shoot at the hull below the waterline, but shot at the gunners in the gun windows. As long as the hull below the waterline of the enemy was penetrated, the enemy's ship would at least lose its maneuverability for a short time, and would have to dispatch personnel to pump out water and block the water. At that time, the enemy's firepower would be much weaker, and it would become a live target. These green hands couldn't figure out such a simple truth. The gunner was very angry at the behavior of these deputy gunners, but now was not the time to be angry. Although the enemy ship dropped its sails and accelerated to escape from the Bold's shooting range. But the guns of the Bold were all installed on movable turrets, and the gunner hurriedly ordered the deputy gunners to aim directly below the enemy's waterline and fire. The trajectory of the Sacramento gun was straight, and at a distance of 300 or 400 meters, it basically hit wherever it was pointed. The 3 secondary guns quickly smashed 3 holes as big as sea bowls below the waterline of the enemy ship. These deputy gunners could vaguely hear the shouts from the enemy ship. The loaders of the secondary guns quickly completed the loading and prepared for the second round of shooting. However, the psychological quality of the enemy ship's crew was so strong that they were able to calmly operate the sails and control the rudder to quickly leave the Bold's firing range even when the ship was leaking. Seeing this, the captain of the Bold, Lin Sen, did not rashly order a pursuit, but only ordered the gunners of the tail gun to shoot at the fleeing enemy ship. The rotation angle of the Bold's secondary gun turret was only 135 degrees, but the 2 main gun turrets at the bow and stern could rotate 360 degrees, with basically no blind spots for shooting. Therefore, although the enemy ship that attacked by surprise escaped the firing range of the secondary guns of the Courageous, it did not escape the firing range of the main guns. The main guns on the Courageous were still able to attack it. Chapter 393 Epilogue. The gunner of the stern gun barely finished 2 rounds of shooting when another Dutch armed merchant ship approached. The approaching Dutch armed merchant ship zigzags and closely bites the stern of the Bold, firing a round of artillery fire at the Bold. 2 solid bullets hit the armor of the rotating platform, which was deformed, and the remaining shells penetrated from the stern of the Bold, causing heavy casualties to the personnel in the cabin. Hitting the stern is one of the most commonly used techniques in the sailing age. After penetrating the stern, the solid shells can often hit from the stern to the bow, causing the greatest degree of casualties to the personnel in the cabin. Just after this round of shelling ended, the armed merchant ship aimed the other side of the ship at the stern of the Bold with a coquettish movement and launched a new round of shelling. For a time, the Bold was hit by 8 or 9 solid bullets, wood chips flew on the deck, and wailing continued in the cabin. 3 crew members on the deck fell in a pool of blood in this round of bombardment, and 6 or 7 crew members were injured by sawdust. Even Liang Zhao's arm was scratched by the flying sawdust, but under the extremely nervous and excited mood, Liang Zhao did not feel any pain at all. As for how many casualties there were in the cabin, Liang Zhao did not know, and there was no time to count these casualties. There was a big gap in the combat quality between the warship crews and merchant ship crews of Liang Zhao's fleet. But there did not seem to be much difference between the Dutch warship crews and merchant ship crews. The merchant ship that was sticking to the Bold showed superb combat quality. The tail gunner turned the tail gun turret and fired a shell at the armed merchant ship that was sticking like an annoying fly. Seeing that the tail gun of the Bold was firing back at them, the gunner of the armed merchant ship immediately used the advantage of their small ship and good maneuverability to avoid the bombardment of the Bold. The shells fired by the 127mm main gun of the Bold brushed past the heads of the crew of the armed merchant ship, just a little bit away from hitting the target. Seeing that the armed merchant ship was getting closer and closer, Lin Sen organized the musketeers on the ship to come to the stern and use the Walter M1851 rifle to shoot at the armed merchant ship. General. Congressman. You two should go into the cabin for a while. These red-haired ghosts are very good at artillery. Seeing that 2 more Dutch ships were approaching, Lin Sen ran to Liang Zhao and Fremont and suggested. From time to time, shells hit the Bold. Although the hull of the Bold was relatively strong, it could still withstand the bombardment of some small-caliber naval guns. But the shells were blind, and Lin Sen was worried that Liang Zhao and Fremont, who were watching and commanding on the deck, would be injured by shells. If I go into the warehouse, how can I observe the battle situation? Just do your part. I am also a crew member on the Bold now, and I will live and die with you. Liang Zhao refused this proposal. Now the battle at sea has entered the most critical moment. The casualties on both sides are not small. It depends on who can hold on to the end. At this juncture, the morale of the crew is extremely critical. If they were to hide in the cabin at this time, it would inevitably have a negative impact on the morale of the crew. Seeing that the Bold was entangled by the enemy, the Yang Wei and 3 Loach boats came up to share the pressure for the Bold. The Yang Wei aimed at the Dutch armed merchant ship stuck to the stern of the Bold and paralyzed the annoying armed merchant ship. A Loach boat following immediately gave the Dutch armed merchant ship another round of artillery fire. However, the 6-pound Sacramento naval gun on the Loach boat was weak and caused limited damage to the opponent. After the Yang Wei completed the reloading, it launched a round of precise artillery fire on the paralyzed armed ship. After this round of artillery fire, the Dutch armed merchant ship completely lost its combat effectiveness. Seawater poured in along the cracks in the hull, and the hull began to sink gradually. The desperate crew on the Dutch armed merchant ship quickly lowered the lifeboat while waving a white flag to surrender. This was the first Dutch ship to raise the white flag and surrender. Seeing the Dutch ship surrender, the crew of Liang Zhao's fleet could not help but boost morale. The other 2 Dutch ships that wanted to approach the Bold immediately fled in disgrace. Liang Zhao looked at the Yang Wei and the 3 Loach ships that were protecting the Bold on both sides, and then looked at the enemy flagship Rotterdam that was exchanging fire with the Roland. He ordered the Yang Wei and the 3 Loach ships and the Bold to form a formation and pounce on the Rotterdam. After the 5 ships completed the formation, they pounced on the Rotterdam with murderous intent. The Rotterdam and the Roland were fighting fiercely, and the Bold, Yang Wei, and the 3 Loach ships that came out halfway caught the Rotterdam off guard. The 6-pound cannon on the Loach ship hit the Rotterdam's huge hull but only scratched the opponent's itch, but the shells fired by the main guns of the Bold and Yang Wei were not scratching the itch. The Rotterdam, which had been hit hard by a round of artillery fire, fled in a hurry with full sails. Liang Zhao led the fleet to chase the Rotterdam. Seeing the flagship being chased, 3 Dutch warships immediately turned around and followed, wanting to share the pressure for the flagship. The 3 Dutch warships that turned around and followed were 2 sailing ships, and one was the only steamship sombing in the Dutch East Indies fleet. After the fierce battle, the gunfire of the Dutch East Indies fleet was obviously much sparser than when the war just started. Obviously, the Dutch suffered a lot of casualties. As long as they can hold on, they can win the final victory in this naval battle. Since the quality of the crew is not as good as the other side, they will hold on to the other side with the technical advantages of the ships. The ships in Liang Zhao's fleet are all steamships with sails. Liang Zhao ordered to continue chasing the Rotterdam, which was fleeing in a hurry, with full sails and coal. Of the 3 Dutch ships that followed, only the Sombing was able to keep up. The other 2 wounded Dutch sailing warships could not keep up with Liang Zhao's formation, even with full sails. Seeing that the flagship was entangled, the Sombing did not hesitate to crash into Liang Zhao's formation, trying to break up Liang Zhao's formation and directly crash into the bold. Madman. Damn it, these red-haired ghosts are crazy. Full left rudder. Avoid the enemy ship, Lin Sen hurriedly ordered to turn the direction to avoid the Sombing's collision. Seeing that the Sombing wanted to hit the bold, Sven on the Roland took the helm himself and took the initiative to meet the Sombing's course. With a loud bang, the 2 colliding ships shook violently. The cast iron armor on the side of the Roland was deformed by the violent collision. However, the Roland still relied on its tonnage advantage to successfully stop the Sombing, which was only 1/3 of its tonnage. After intercepting the Sombing, Sven immediately ordered the crew to take out the grappling hook and board the Sombing, intending to capture the steamer. After Liang Zhao reorganized the fleet, he saw that the enemy's flagship Rotterdam had fled south in a panic under the cover of other warships, so he gave up the pursuit. The control of the sea and the Java Sea was under the control of the Dutch, and Liang Zhao was not sure whether there were other Dutch ships outside the battlefield. It was very dangerous and stupid to rashly leave the main force during the war. Seeing that the Roland was boarding the Sombing, Liang Zhao pulled out a Loach-class ship from the fleet and asked the crew of the Loach-class ship to jump onto the Sombing to assist the Roland in capturing the Sombing. He himself led the fleet to clear other Dutch ships in the battlefield. After most of the day's fierce battle, both sides were exhausted and suffered heavy losses. The seriously injured ships began to gradually withdraw from the battlefield, and the naval battle entered its final stage. Chapter 394, Battle Results and Casualties. The fierce battle lasted until 3 p.m. The fierce naval battle in the waters near Pontianak ended with the Dutch East Indies fleet withdrawing from the battlefield first. Liang Zhao ordered the fleet to pursue for a while and then return to the battlefield to clean up the battlefield and count the casualties and results. In this naval battle, Liang Zhao suffered the greatest loss from the clippers requisitioned from the civilian population. Although these clippers were carefully selected and selected as civilian ships in relatively good condition. But after all, they were still civilian ships with extremely limited protection capabilities, unlike wooden-hulled warships wrapped in cast iron armor, which could continue to fight as long as the loss of personnel was not large after several rounds of bombardment. Of the 18 participating clippers, 4 were directly sunk, 6 were seriously injured, and the remaining clippers were basically injured. As for the Loach ships, 2 of the 8 participating Loach ships were directly sunk, 3 were seriously injured, and the remaining 3 Loach ships were slightly injured. The situation of the 4 battleships was slightly better, but not much better. The Roland and Cheoang were seriously injured and needed to return to Xiangshan for overhaul to restore their combat effectiveness. Liang Zhao's flagship, the Bold, was in moderate condition. As long as the lost crew was supplemented, it could still fight. The best situation was the Yang Wei, which was only slightly injured and had little loss of personnel, so it could continue to fight. In terms of results, 3 enemy sailing warships were sunk in this battle, including 2 6th-level sailing warships and 1 4th-level sailing warship, and 1 enemy steam warship and 1 5th-level sailing warship were captured. 3 civilian merchant ships recruited by the Dutch Indonesian authorities were also directly sunk, 4 were captured, and countless people were injured. After most of the day's high-intensity artillery fire, unless you run away before the battle, it is impossible not to be injured, but the degree of damage to the ship is different. The casualties in terms of personnel were even more shocking. Before the war, the number of crew members participating in the battle was 3,400. After this battle, only less than 2,500 crew members were able to continue to participate in the next military operations. 366 crew members were killed or missing, and 541 crew members suffered moderate or above injuries. Crew members like Liang Zhao, who suffered minor skin injuries and were still able to participate in military operations, have not been counted. The Dutch crew casualties are estimated to be comparable to their own, or slightly lower. Judging from the increasingly sparse gunfire at the end of the battlefield, the Dutch casualties were not much better, with 318 Dutch crew bodies salvaged alone. Since the Dutch took the initiative to withdraw from the battlefield first, Liang Zhao also captured 371 Dutch crew members on the battlefield. Counting these captured personnel, the Dutch personnel losses were more embarrassing than Liang Zhao's. After all, Liang Zhao still controlled the battlefield and could rescue the crew members who fell into the water and the crew members on the lifeboats, while the crew members of the Dutch East Indies fleet who failed to escape the battlefield in time could only be captured if they wanted to survive. Of course, if the losses of the Guangdong Navy and pirates are also included in the statistics, the personnel losses on Liang Zhao's side are still a little greater. Guangdong Navy Admiral Hong Mingxiang and pirate leader Li Fengzhen came to the bold to ask Liang Zhao for the balance. The two incompatible characters, the Guangdong Navy Admiral and the pirate leader, stood together to ask Liang Zhao for the balance, which made Liang Zhao inexplicably feel a little funny. Liang Zhao took out a pen, signed 2 checks and handed them to the two. There are branches of Bank of America in Jiangshan and Guangzhou. You can use these bills to withdraw the balance at any Bank of America. The Guangdong Navy and the pirates both persisted to the end and did not run away. They were very righteous. The role they played was completely beyond Liang Zhao's expectations. Liang Zhao originally only expected them to support the scene and act as a cheerleader, but he didn't expect them to achieve good results. The Guangdong Navy sank an armed merchant ship, captured a 5th-level sailing warship, and the pirates even captured 2 armed merchant ships. Of course, their losses were also heavy. There were 860 people from the Guangdong Navy who went to the expedition with Hong Mingxiang, 180 of them were killed, and countless were injured. Of the 3 Loach-class armed patrol boats brought by Hong Mingxiang, 1 was sunk by the Dutch, and the other 2 were also damaged to varying degrees. There were 1,100 pirates who followed Li Fengzhen to the expedition, 286 of whom were killed and countless were injured. Hong Mingxiang happily took the check handed over by Liang Zhao. He was still counting on using the money to provide pensions to the soldiers. Besides, the money was what he deserved, so there was no need to be shy. Li Fengzhen did not take the check. Liang Zhao thought that Li Fengzhen felt that it was too dangerous to go to Jiangshan or Guangzhou to withdraw money, so he said to Li Fengzhen, "If you think it's troublesome to withdraw cash in Jiangshan or Guangzhou, I can pay directly in US dollar gold coins. If you can pay in US dollars, it would be great." "May I ask if Mr. Liang paid California dollars?" Li Fengzhen said happily. The US dollar coins of this era are real gold and silver coins, not paper money, but also hard currency. Of course, due to the influence of the country, the US dollar is still not as hard as the British pound. But the pirates were also willing to accept the US dollar. After all, it was real gold and silver, and its actual value was there. Thanks to California's abundant gold and good casting technology, the US dollar minted in California is famous for its good quality and excellent casting, and is the best among US dollar coins. Soon, Lin Sen, under Liang Zhao's instruction, led the crew into Liang Zhao's cabin, counted a box of US dollar coins and carried the heavy box out. "Mr. Liang, can I use this money to buy some guns and cannons from you, and buy another captured armed merchant ship?" Li Fengzhen said. "I am interested in hiring you. If you are willing to be employed by me, I can provide you with guns and cannons for free." Liang Zhao looked directly into Li Fengzhen's eyes. "What does Mr. Liang want me to do?" Li Fengzhen was a smart man and reacted quickly. "Robbery of Dutch merchant ships," Liang Zhao said. "The Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia are distributed on various islands, and the sea routes are the lifeline for the Dutch Indonesian authorities to maintain their rule over these colonies. Letting pirates harass the Dutch routes can also force the Dutch to divide their troops to protect these routes and reduce their own maritime pressure." Liang Zhao thought it was worthwhile to spend some arms and money to hire these pirates. Moreover, pirates could do some things that Liang Zhao could not do directly. "This is Li's job. Li is willing to be employed by Mr. Liang," Li Fengzhen said with a smile. "In recent years, there are more and more Western ships in Southeast Asia, and their equipment is getting better and better. The pirates are not having a good time. It is a good thing to have a strong force to provide them with protection and support." Li Fengzhen has no reason to refuse. Hong Mingxiang walked to the turret of the naval gun, looked at the new gun on the bold with curiosity, and asked Liang Zhao, "Can you fire a few shots to help cheer us up?" Liang Zhao nodded. After the loader finished loading, the gunner locked onto the wreckage of a nearby unmanned Dutch shipwreck, adjusted the parameters, and then explained to Hong Mingxiang how to fire the naval gun. Hong Mingxiang fired the cannon, and with just one shot, the naval gun hit the wreckage of the Dutch shipwreck. Hong Mingxiang fired 2 more shots to satisfy his craving, and exclaimed, "Good cannon, good cannon. This cannon is extremely accurate and has a very fast firing rate. It is the best cannon that Hong has ever seen. When did you come up with this kind of cannon? This is indeed the best naval gun in the world. If it weren't for this cannon, Liang Zhao would have lost this naval battle long ago." Thinking of his fleet holding the most advanced weapons and the opponent of the sailing warships having such an ugly loss ratio, Liang Zhao's expression also became ugly. One reason is that he was very dissatisfied with the performance of the Navy this time. With the advantage in technology and numbers, this naval battle was still so difficult that the ship almost capsized. Weapons are certainly important, but the people who use the weapons are more important. The foundation of the California Navy is really too thin. It was so difficult to fight the Dutch colonial fleet, and there was no need to fight against Britain and France. If you want to protect your rights and interests at sea, it is imperative to tilt resources to the Navy in the future. Secondly, the pain in his arm, which was previously scratched by sawdust, gradually came up, and Liang Zhao was in so much pain that he gasped. Lin Sanking called the doctor who was sawing off the wounded man's leg on the deck to come over and treat Liang Zhao's wound again. The ship's doctor handed the work to a carpenter and immediately ran over to carefully treat Liang Zhao's wound. After the wound was treated again, Liang Zhao felt a little better and said to Hong Mingxiang, "I have been developing this cannon for several years, and it was only successfully trial produced at the end of last year. I lost a loachboat this time, which is the treasure of the Guangdong Navy. You have to sell me another one at a lower price. Of course, it would be even better if my loachboat could be replaced with your new cannon," Hong Mingxiang said. "If you can replace my guns with new ones, and we can land in Pontianak, I will let my Dubao battalion and the Guangdong Navy's naval infantry help you fight, no problem." Liang Zhao did not tell Hong Mingxiang about the attack on Pontianak. After all, no matter how good his relationship with Hong Mingxiang was, he was still a person outside the California system, and Liang Zhao could not reveal too much inside information to Hong Mingxiang. However, Hong Mingxiang was not a fool. If he was really stupid, he would not be able to become the admiral of the Guangdong Navy. Hong Mingxiang, who came from the grassroots of the Navy, was able to become the admiral of the Guangdong Navy. In addition to Su Guangzhen's support, he also had some ability. Liang Zhao would not fight with the Dutch at sea for no reason. Fighting with the Dutch in the waters near Pontianak was nothing more than paving the way for the subsequent landing in Pontianak. Hong Mingxiang could guess this. "Really?" Liang Zhao asked. The casualties of the beach landing would not be small. Although Liang Zhao specially organized a training exercise for the beach landing before the war, the training exercise was only a training exercise after all, not an actual combat. Liang Zhao had no idea how many casualties it would take to take Pontianak. If Hong Mingxiang was willing to help, his Western Brigade would have fewer casualties. Really, seeing Liang Zhao agree so readily, Hong Mingxiang regretted it and proposed more conditions. "It's a deal," Liang Zhao smiled. It was already sunset when they finished cleaning up the battlefield. It was too late to land today, so they could only let the soldiers of the California Infantry Regiment who were preparing to participate in the landing have a good rest and prepare to land in Pontianak tomorrow to liberate their compatriots in the Pontianak area. Chapter 395. The Dutch own the position, but your life is your own. Although the naval battle was over, the air still had a strong smell of blood that made people uncomfortable. In the cabin of the Bold, by the light of the kerosene lamp, Fremont was polishing a manuscript titled The Dutch East India Fleet. Although the Dutch ships temporarily fled back to Batavia, the Dutch East Indies fleet still has strength. As long as the ships are repaired and the personnel are supplemented, the Dutch East Indies fleet can still restore its combat effectiveness. This naval battle for control of the Java Sea and the South China Sea has not ended. Liang Zhao and the Dutch still have a battle. He must prepare early. Liang Zhao is most worried about the Dutch mainland fleet coming to support the Dutch East Indies fleet. If the Dutch mainland fleet and the East Indies fleet join forces at that time, the problem will be tricky. Liang Zhao does not have much time left. He must gain a foothold in Borneo during the gap when the Dutch temporarily lose control of the sea, and achieve the greatest results as quickly as possible, so as to force the Dutch to the negotiation table as soon as possible. I hope California can bear these losses, Fremont sighed. If California can't afford this loss, we don't deserve to take Borneo, Liang Zhao said. The next day, Hong Ming-Xiang's Tabao Battalion and 2 battalions of the California Infantry Regiment were ready to land when the tide rose. Pontianak is not a coastal city, but is located in the lower reaches of the Kapuas River. There is still a distance of 20 kilometers from the coast to Pontianak. The defenders of Pontianak have deployed artillery on both sides of the Kapuas River, sank merchant ships to block the river channel into Pontianak port, and prevent Liang Zhao's army from using the river channel to approach Pontianak city. Liang Zhao can only choose to land on the nearby beach, and then break through the blockade of the Pontianak defenders and advance to Pontianak port in the city. At this time in Pontianak, Ye Tanghu, the former general manager of Lanfang Company, ordered his 180 confidants to change into the uniforms of Umbrella Company, carrying the umbrella flag, and taking Elvis 70 crew members, armed with guns and cannons, and rushed to Pontianak port with great momentum. They planned to take down the port's artillery turrets according to the plan, delay the Pontianak defenders' strength, and reduce the pressure on the landing troops. Before departure, Ye Tanghu had asked his confidants to spread the news that the Californians had entered Pontianak in the city. For a time, the defenders of Pontianak were panicked. The local residents either fled to the mountains to avoid the war or stayed at home. Elvis set up 3 6-pound infantry guns and launched an artillery attack on the Pontianak port fort. The Pontianak port fort was guarded by a white infantry company of the Royal Dutch East India Army and half of the Green Battalion of the Lanfang Company, with a force of more than 200 people. The sudden bombardment caught the defenders on the fort off guard, and they ran around like headless flies. Did the California Army break into Pontianak so quickly? The captain was killed. The captain was killed. The defenders on the port fort had not yet reacted when they heard the bad news that the captain had been killed. The captain was killed, and the lieutenant had returned to Batavia for vacation a week ago. Lieutenant Carlito suddenly became the supreme commander of the fort defenders, but Carlito was not happy at all. In a trance, the rain of metal bullets fired from the enemy's position hit them head-on, suppressing the Dutch defenders on the port fort so that they could not raise their heads. As for the Chinese who were guarding the port fort with them, they were still holding flintlocks or even matchlocks from a century or two ago, and they could not be counted on at all. The enemy's gunfire was very dense, and this was the firepower that could only be fired by a regiment of infantry. The Walter M1851 rifle had a fast firing rate, and 250 guns fired the firepower of a regiment, which made the defenders on the Pontianak port fort mistakenly believe that the enemy had a regiment of troops attacking. We were surrounded by a regiment of the enemy. As for where this regiment of enemy troops came from, the defenders on the Pontianak port fort had no time to think about it, nor did they want to think about this problem. Lieutenant Carrito was very sure that he was surrounded by a regiment of the enemy. He didn't even have the courage to refuse danger and defend, but just ordered the armed forces of the Lanfang Company to stay to block the enemy, and he took a company of white soldiers and hurriedly retreated to the city, under the pretext of asking for reinforcements. The Chinese soldiers of the Lanfang Company naturally didn't do it, because a regiment was 1,000 people. Let them fight with a regiment of California soldiers with their fire sticks in their hands? Isn't this sending them to death? The composition of the Pontianak garrison was complex and the ranks were very clear. The best were undoubtedly the Dutch soldiers, followed by other European soldiers, and then the indigenous soldiers, mainly Javanese. The Chinese soldiers of the Lanfang Company were at the bottom, and were discriminated against and exploited. Not to mention the Dutch, even the Javanese could bully them. They were often bullied by white officers and soldiers, so naturally they had no awareness of sacrificing for the Dutch. The artillery position belonged to the Dutch, but their lives were their own. As soon as the Dutch left, the soldiers of the Lanfang Company immediately retreated back to the city with the Dutch. In less than 15 minutes, the artillery position at the Pontianak wharf was empty. Even Elvis was very surprised. Just retreat like that? Ye Tanghu also felt that there was a trick. For the sake of caution and safety, Ye Tanghu sent a few confidants to the artillery position to spy on it. After confirming that the artillery position had been abandoned by the Pontianak garrison, He and Elvis occupied the artillery position at the Pontianak port. Damn it, these red-haired ghosts and traitors ran so fast, not a single person was left behind, Yu Tenghu cursed while holding a cold revolver in his hand. On the fort of Pontianak port, except for 16 corpses, there was no living person left. Elvis lowered the red, white and blue tricolor flag of the Dutch and raised the umbrella flag of the Umbrella Company, officially announcing that the California Armed Forces had occupied the fort of Pontianak port. Chapter 396 Surrender? Colonel, there's a big fish here. After the bodies were gathered, a crew member pointed at the Dutch captain who was killed by the bombardment and said to Elvis, "Big fish." Elvis glanced at the body of the Dutch captain with disdain. "The rank is not as high as mine, just a small captain, a small fish and shrimp." The crew members couldn't help laughing. "There might be only one person with a higher rank than you on the entire island." Elvis took out a telescope to observe the situation in Pontianak. At this time, Pontianak was in chaos, and the city was full of Dutch Indonesian colonial soldiers running around. After observing for a while, Elvis put down the telescope and said to Yu Tenghu, "Mr. Yi, your people will stay at the fort, and the 3 guns will be left to you. You must guard the fort." Elvis looked at the chaotic Pontianak and decided to take advantage of the chaos to make a big deal. "Colonel, are you leaving the fort?" Yu Tenghu said in surprise. "My mission is to disrupt the Pontianak garrison and create chaos. I will lead people to charge into the city and give the Dutch a surprise," Elvis said with a relaxed look. "Charge into the city?" Yu Tenghu's eyes widened. "Do you think you're Zhao Zilan? Do you want to fight your way in and out of Pontianak? But you only have 70 people. There are at least thousands of garrisons in Pontianak, but they don't know that I only have 70 people," Elvis said confidently. "Mr. Liang told me about the Fishu War that took place in China more than 1,000 years ago. Now the Dutch garrison in Pontianak is the million-strong army of the former Qin dynasty. Although there are many people, there is nothing to be afraid of. Will a wolf be afraid of 100 sheep? There are thousands of garrisons in Pontianak, but after falling into chaos and morale collapse, thousands of garrisons will definitely not be able to exert the combat effectiveness that thousands of garrisons should have. The composition of the Pontianak garrison is complex and the people are not united. How much combat effectiveness they can have also needs to be questioned." The reality was just as Elvis expected. After learning that the East Indies fleet had withdrawn to Batavia, the morale of the defenders in Pontianak was already very low. Land transportation on Borneo is inconvenient, and their supplies rely on sea transportation. The withdrawal of the East Indies fleet to Batavia means that they have lost control of the sea, and subsequent logistics supply will become a big problem. Now a regiment of troops suddenly appeared in Pontianak, which made the already low morale of the Dutch Indonesian defenders even worse. "General, an enemy regiment has taken down our artillery position in the port. We fought hard but lost, and the captain unfortunately died. I have led my troops to break through. We have preserved our manpower," Quirito, who hastily retreated to Pontianak, reported to Anderson, the Dutch Indonesian garrison commander. "Breakthrough? Quirito. Where are our Lanfang Company soldiers?" Yu Tenghu looked at Quirito, whose clothes were cleaner than his own, and naturally would not believe Quirito's words. The soldiers on the Pontianak fort were the elite of the Lanfang Company. Needless to say, it must be Carlito who left the Lanfang soldiers on the fort to guard the rear and then ran away. Thinking of this, Yu Tenghu immediately became anxious. When Carlito was thinking about how to explain this problem, the officer of the Lanfang soldiers also ran in and said, "Our Lanfang soldiers have also broken through." How could Anderson not see the problem that Yu Tenghu could see? Besides, Pontianak City is 20 kilometers away from the coast. The California Army must wait for high tide to land. Now is high tide. If nothing unexpected happens, the California Army has just started to land. How can a regiment of soldiers come from under their noses? Could it be that the California Army can fly and grow wings to fly to Pontianak? Anderson was about to deal with these deserters when he heard gunshots in the city. The guards ran in a panic and reported, "General, the enemy has entered Pontianak." Anderson's face sank, and his heartbeat accelerated. He asked Carlito in a deep voice, "Carlito, did you see clearly? Is there really a regiment?" "General, I am also a veteran." From the sound of gunfire, the enemy's firepower is extremely fierce. They also have cannons. It must be a regiment. There is no mistake. Carlito insisted that there was a regiment of the enemy attacking the port fort. One regiment. At least one regiment. The enemy is a black mass. People are next to each other, at least several thousand people, the Lanfang officer beside him also hurriedly said. Anderson fell into silence. Although he remained calm on the surface, his heart had long been like a mess. Pontianak originally had 4,000 defenders, one of which was composed of elite white soldiers and old Java soldiers. In addition to this elite regiment, he also had 2,000 Pontianak native soldiers and 1,000 Lanfang soldiers to call on. But since the Chinese resistance organization on the island launched a crazy attack on Dongwonlu and other places, Anderson had to divide his troops to suppress the Chinese resistance organization. In order to guard against the landing of the California Army, he deployed another 2,000 troops to defend the coast. Now the defenders in Pontianak City are fully occupied, and Anderson can only mobilize 1,000. Moreover, the soldiers before are not all white soldiers. A considerable number of soldiers are indigenous people, and these indigenous people are not reliable at all. He may not be able to withstand the elite of the other side attacking Pontianak. Anderson turned his back, looked at the map on the wall, and fell into thought. Now his army's morale is low and in chaos. It is no longer realistic to organize an effective resistance force to hold Pontianak and wait for reinforcements from Batavia or Kendangan, the base of their Dutch-Indonesian army in West Borneo. It seems that retreating to preserve the force is the wisest choice now. The California Army has a good record, and its combat effectiveness is definitely not comparable to the armies of the Chinese colonial companies on the island, such as the Dagon Company and the Sanjiao Company. After a brief thought, Anderson decisively issued an order: notify the troops in the city and the troops on the coastal positions to take the expatriates out of Pontianak and head south to Kendangan. At this time, in the lower reaches of the Kapuas River, Liang Zhao's fleet was bombarding the Dutch Indian positions along the coast with the tide, clearing the obstacles for the subsequent landing troops. Liang Zhao's fleet is mainly composed of small ships, but small ships also have their advantages. Small ships are shallow, so they can get closer to the coast to bombard. The strength of the Dutch Indian Navy is good, but their army's combat effectiveness is really not good. Fremont raised his telescope and looked at the Royal Dutch Indian Army soldiers who kept fleeing their positions under the bombardment. If it were all Dutch soldiers, the situation might be better. Unfortunately, it was a Dutch officer who coerced a group of natives to fight. Such an army has no cohesion at all. Liang Zhao agreed with Fremont's point of view. The Dutch East Indies fleet can fight, in addition to the inheritance of the Dutch naval power. Another very important reason is that most of their sailors are experienced Dutch and European sailors, and the core personnel of the fleet are all Dutch, with basically no indigenous sailors. Therefore, command and organization are handy. The army of the Royal Netherlands Indochina Army is completely the opposite. The Dutch and whites are a minority, and the local indigenous people are the majority. The ratio of white soldiers to indigenous soldiers in the Royal Netherlands Indochina Army is 1 to 3. Such an army can fight a favorable battle with its technical advantages, but once it encounters an opponent stronger than itself, it will be vulnerable. There are so many natives on the shore. It is estimated that the red-haired ghosts use these natives as cannon fodder, and they shrink in Pontianak City. There are too many white soldiers in Pontianak City, and I am afraid that it will be a tough battle during the siege, Deng Wenqi said. Liang Zhao took out his pocket watch to check the time. He didn't know whether Elvis, who was lurking in Pontianak, had taken down the artillery position in Pontianak port. You guys are firing shells like they are free. I have been a soldier since the reign of Emperor Jiaqing. I have been a soldier for decades, but I have never fought such a rich battle. Hong Mingxiang looked at Liang Zhao's fleet pouring shells towards the coast like they were free, and couldn't help showing envy. Firing more shells means fewer deaths. My soldiers' lives are very valuable, more valuable than shells. Liang Zhao put away his pocket watch and ordered, prepare for landing. Hong Mingxiang also ordered drums to prepare for battle. The landing troops were led by the sailors of the Guangdong Navy, followed by 2 battalions of the California Infantry Regiment, who rowed small boats and rushed to the coast during the high tide. Seeing the enemy rushing up, the Dutch officers who stayed behind hurriedly tore off the white part of the Dutch flag, made a simple white flag, and raised the white flag to surrender. The first to rush to the Dutch Indonesian Army position were the sailors of the Guangdong Navy led by the Deputy General of the Guangdong Navy, Kang Ens. Kang Ens was holding a Walter 1851 rifle with a bayonet, and was about to fight the Dutch Royal Indochina Army to the death. Unexpectedly, just before he arrived at the position, the other side raised the white flag before the battle. Kang Ens thought the other side was cheating, but he didn't expect that 70 or 80 white officers and 500 or 600 native soldiers threw out their weapons, raised their hands and shouted in English, "Stop fighting. We surrender. We surrender." Seeing that the people rushing up were Chinese, the white officers didn't know how to say surrender in Chinese. So they simply knelt on the ground and raised their hands to show that they had no intention of resisting. Kang Ens was so confused that he took down the position of the Dutch Royal Indochina Army without any casualties. Soon, Liang Zhao on the Bold learned that the Dutch Royal Indochina Army had surrendered. Just surrendered like that. After listening to Kang Ens's report, Liang Zhao felt a loss when he looked at Hong Mingxiang, who was secretly happy. If he had known that the Dutch Royal Indochina Army was so vulnerable on land, he would have fought himself. After landing, Liang Zhao looked at the 725 prisoners waiting in line for inspection, and felt that things were not that simple. He called the highest-ranking officer among the surrenderers to ask, "Do you only have so many people on your coastal positions? Originally there were 2,000 people. After Pontianak fell, General Anderson ordered us to retreat. We are the unlucky ones who stayed behind to cover the rear." The major of the Royal Dutch Indonesian Army, who was question answered like a bamboo tube pouring beans. "Pontianak fell." Liang Zhao's eyes widened. "Hasn't one of your regiments already attacked Pontianak?" the major said. "A regiment? Not to mention a regiment." Elvis, who was responsible for disrupting the enemy's rear in Pontianak, had only 70 crew members under his command, and only 71 people including himself, not even a company. Could it be that the Lampang army in Pontianak had rebelled? Liang Zhao was also confused and didn't understand what was going on. Could it be that this was a trap set by the Dutch to lure the enemy deep into the depths? To ambush them on the land where they marched into Pontianak? Chapter 397 Initiative. At first, Liang Zhao was worried that this was a trick of the Dutch to provoke an invasion, so he did not dare to go deep into the city rashly. He only organized part of the Guangdong Navy and a battalion of California Infantry Regiment to form an advance force, ready to march steadily in advance to Pontianak, and then find out the truth and confirm whether what the prisoners of war said was true. Pontianak was important to Liang Zhao, but it was also important to the Dutch Indonesian authorities. Losing Pontianak meant that the Dutch Indonesian authorities lost their logistics supply points in West Borneo and lost the initiative in the West Borneo region. Liang Zhao could see this, and the Dutch Indonesian authorities must have seen it too. Liang Zhao's supply was highly dependent on the port, and so was the Dutch Indonesian authorities. Soon, before the vanguard arrived in Pontianak, Elvis sent a signalman to inform Liang Zhao of the current situation in Pontianak. Pontianak was indeed lost. Those Dutch prisoners of war did not deceive him. The Dutch hurriedly evacuated Pontianak, and before leaving, they did not even have time to destroy the inventory of supplies in Pontianak's warehouses to prevent them from aiding the enemy. Liang Zhao breathed a sigh of relief when he learned that Pontianak had been taken. A tough battle had just been fought at sea, and it was always a good thing to avoid a tough battle on land. Since Pontianak had been taken, the first thing to do was to dredge the waterway of the Kapuas River and restore navigation as soon as possible. Liang Zhao did not expect to rely on the inventory of materials left by the Dutch Indonesian authorities to defend Pontianak, the fruit of victory that had just been picked. After all, the calibers of the guns and artillery of both sides were different. The soldiers of the Western Brigade, who were accustomed to using Walter M1851 rifles and Sacramento guns, would certainly not be accustomed to the Dutch's broken guns and artillery. Of course, the beachhead position could not be lost. He could fight Pontianak, and the Dutch Indonesian authorities would also seek to retake Pontianak after they reacted. Liang Zhao left behind the Engineer Battalion and the Beaver Regiment, which were the two battalions of the Oregon Infantry Regiment that went with the team. The Engineer Battalion was responsible for mapping on the spot, designing and constructing the beach defense line, and arranging artillery positions. The two battalions of the Oregon Infantry Regiment were responsible for the defense of the beachhead position. As long as the beachhead position is well managed, Pontianak, 20 kilometers away from the beachhead, can be used as a stable and safe rear base, without having to face the artillery fire of the Dutch East Indies fleet directly. Even if the Dutch East Indies Army came in full force, Liang Zhao would have enough reaction time and sufficient buffer space. It would not be like the Dutch East Indies Army, which lost Pontianak so quickly. The Dutch East Indies authorities have been operating Borneo for many years, and the Dutch East Indies Army has other bases on Borneo. If they lost Pontianak, they would have a place to retreat. If Liang Zhao lost Pontianak, he would have no place to retreat to, and could only retreat to the deep mountains and forests inland to play hide-and-seek with the Dutch. Such a result was unacceptable to Liang Zhao. I will stay to assist the engineering battalion in surveying and building the beachhead defense formula. Fremont took the initiative to ask Liang Zhao to stay. He was an engineer, and this job was also professionally suitable. Then I'll trouble you. After I arrive in Pontianak, I will immediately recruit some personnel to help build the beach defense positions. The positions built by the Dutch are too rough and cannot be used directly. Liang Zhao glanced at the crude positions of the Dutch Indonesian army and said, "General, can you transfer another artillery company?" Kruger, the commander of the Oregon Infantry Regiment responsible for the beach defense, hoped that Liang Zhao could allocate him an artillery company. The artillery is a direct unit of the Western Brigade and is directly under the command of Liang Zhao. It has not been delegated to the regiment level. This is not because the artillery production of the Sacramento arsenal cannot keep up, but because the reserve of artillery talents cannot keep up. Expanding an artillery company to an artillery battalion is already the limit of California's artillery talent reserve. California's population size limits California's war potential. Therefore, although Liang Zhao has been expanding the army, the scale of the expansion is relatively limited. Moreover, Liang Zhao pursues a policy of elite troops. Based on the principle of better to have less than less, he also has relatively high requirements for the quality of soldiers. I'll leave an artillery company for you. The field guns of the artillery company can't block the Kapuas River. We have heavy guns in the warehouse in Xiangshan. I will ask Global Shipping Company to transport the heavy guns here immediately. Liang Zhao pointed to the wide estuary of the Kapuas River and said, "Before the heavy guns arrive, you only have 6-pound and 10-pound field guns available. Even if you use these field guns, you must guard the estuary for me. Don't let any Dutch warships or any Dutch soldiers enter Pontianak." Do you understand? Although Liang Zhao had an artillery battalion, he only brought 2 companies with him this time, and the remaining companies stayed in California to train new recruits. At most, he could only transfer 1 company of artillery to Kruger, and the remaining company of artillery would be kept to take Pontianak or participate in subsequent military operations. Yes, General. Please rest assured, our Beaver Regiment will hold our position even if we fight to the last man. Kruger straightened his chest and saluted Liang Zhao. This was the first combat mission of the Beaver Regiment, and he hoped that the Beaver Regiment he had brought out could perform well in this mission. After Kruger left, Liang Zhao asked the engineering battalion to immediately build a telegraph line from here to Pontianak so that he could learn about the situation of the beachhead at the first time. Since the Kapuas River had been blocked by sunken ships by the Dutch, it would take some time to dredge the river. Liang Zhao's large army could only walk to Pontianak. After less than 2 hours of marching, Liang Zhao rode a horse and led the follow-up large army into Pontianak. The Dutch quickly and decisively withdrew from Pontianak, and no fierce battle broke out in Pontianak. Even when Elvis led his army into Pontianak, there was only sporadic exchange of fire with the Royal Dutch Indonesian Army, and no artillery was used. Therefore, the Battle of Pontianak caused minimal damage to the entire city of Pontianak. Liang Zhao got a Pontianak that was intact and had normal infrastructure. The Dutch ran away so fast. I only captured 240 prisoners, of which only 65 were Dutch, and the rest were Chinese and local natives. Elvis came out to greet Liang Zhao. "Okay, I know you captured 240 prisoners," Liang Zhao said. "You are the first to take Pontianak." Liang Zhao didn't know how Elvis captured 240 prisoners with 70 people. However, compared with the Dutch Indonesian authorities' naval power, their land military power was indeed weak. Should we continue to pursue the Dutch Indonesian troops fleeing southward to expand the results of the war? Elvis asked. The most urgent task is to consolidate the results we have achieved. It is not advisable to pursue rashly. Liang Zhao shook his head and said. If he was familiar with the situation in West Borneo, Liang Zhao would certainly be willing to pursue the enemy with the remaining courage, but in reality, Liang Zhao was not familiar with the situation in West Borneo, and he didn't even have an accurate map of West Borneo. Liang Zhao's understanding of West Borneo basically came from the intelligence provided by local Chinese. Liang Zhao did not want to see large-scale non-combat casualties, and preferred to consolidate the results that had been achieved. Borneo is a wild and desolate place. Outside the city, it is full of smoke and miasma, and there are many snakes and insects. The snakes and insects here are much more poisonous than those in Guangdong. We, the old visitors who have lived in West Borneo for 20 to 30 years, still get lost when we enter the deep mountains and forests, not to mention the new visitors who have just arrived in Borneo. Liu Shanbang also suggested not to pursue rashly. Chapter 398 Pontianak. Half of the people in Pontianak are Chinese, and the rest are local natives. Those who believe in Islam are called Borneans, and those who believe in native religions are called Dayaks. Yu Ten, who accompanied Liang Zhao to visit Pontianak while introducing the situation in Pontianak to Liang Zhao. The Islam that Yu Ten who mentioned is Islam. Islam is the main religious belief in the Indonesian archipelago. In addition to Islam, the local ethnic groups have their own complex religious beliefs. Even for the same religion, people in different regions may not believe in the same gods, which is difficult to say. But these local native religions have one thing in common, that is, they all believe that all things such as birds, beasts, plants and trees have spirits, which can be summarized as animism religions. Just like the Chinese who are at odds with each other based on their hometowns, clans and regions, the Muslims and animists on the island also are at odds with each other and regard each other as pagans. Are there any Dutch expatriates? Liang Zhao asked. Of course there are red barbarian expatriates, but there are not many, only about 500 to 600 people. Now many red barbarian expatriates have fled to the south. The remaining red barbarian expatriates are estimated to be no more than 300 people, Liu Shanbang replied. Dutch expatriates have always been a minority in the Indonesian archipelago, and the population proportion is not high. The population of the Netherlands is very limited, and it is impossible to Dutchize the colonies. Even in Java Island, where the Dutch rule has the deepest foundation and has been operating for more than 200 years, the Dutch population proportion is at an absolute disadvantage. There are nearly 10 million Javanese in Java Island, and the number of Dutch settled in Java Island has not exceeded 40,000 so far, and most of the Dutch in Java Island are still concentrated in Batavia. What does this mean? The population of the Han people, another foreign immigrant group on Java Island, is 400,000 to 500,000. In other words, the population of the Dutch in the core ruling area of the Indonesian archipelago is less than 1/10 of the Chinese immigrants. Implementing limited tributary rule over the colonies, controlling important trade bases, and grabbing as much economic benefits as possible from the colonies are already the limits of what a country of the size of the Netherlands can do. Just a few hundred people bullied tens of thousands of you like this, Liang Zhao sighed. When the Han people were a minority in California, they were not bullied by the whites like this. The red barbarians are very cunning and good at sowing discord. When the Cantonese became powerful, they instigated the Chaoshan people to fight the Cantonese. When the Chaoshan people became powerful, they instigated the Hakka people to fight the Chaoshan people. When the Hakka people became powerful, they instigated the Zhangzhou and Quanzhou people to fight the Hakka people. When the Hakka people became powerful, they instigated the natives to fight the Hakka people. When the natives became powerful, they instigated the Chinese to fight the natives, weakening each other's strength, and so on, Yu Ten who argued. If you all work together, the Dutch will be helpless even if they want to sow discord. Liang Zhao shook his head and said. The most important reason why the Chinese on the island of Borneo are in such a mess is that they are fighting among themselves. Tell me about the situation of the native chiefdoms nearby. There are 4 major native chiefdoms near us, namely the Pontianak chiefdom in the south, whose chief is Al-Qadri, with 100,000 chiefs. The Sanfa chiefdom in the north, whose chief is Akam, with 70,000 to 80,000 chiefs. The Brunei chiefdom in the northeast, whose chief is Omar, has 200,000 chiefs. The Zindang chiefdom in the inland east, whose chief is Abdul, has more than 40,000 chiefs, Liu Shanbang replied. Except for the slightly rich Pontianak chiefdom, the rest are very poor and not to be feared. The only difficult thing in the entire Borneo island is the red barbarians. Liu Shanbang also fought with the local chiefdoms, but they were just a group of rabble and not to be worried about. These chiefdoms can handle themselves without Liang Zhao's help. What about the Lanfang Company? How are they doing? Liang Zhao asked about the situation of the Lanfang Company. Liang Zhao certainly did not intend to accept the senior executives of the Lanfang Company who defected to the Dutch Indonesian authorities. But Liang Zhao was willing to accept the ordinary miners and their families under the rule of the Lanfang Company. Population, especially core population, is sometimes a more valuable resource than natural resources. Liang Zhao could not convert the local Borneans who believed in Islam and the Dayaks who believed in native religion into core population that he could use for himself in a short time. But the Chinese with the same cultural background could, which is why Southeast Asia is so large, and Liang Zhao finally set his sights on the island of Borneo and decided to open a rubber plantation in Borneo. Part of the Lanfang Company's armed forces who stayed in Dongwonlu followed Anderson to Kendalingen in the south, and another part took back the Dongwonlu nest, and the remaining small part is now our captive, Liu Shanbang said. Kendalingen is a port 300 kilometers south of Pontianak. Of course, the 300 kilometers here refers to the straight line distance. In fact, Anderson has to travel more than 300 kilometers from Pontianak to Kendalingen by land. The long march and retreat in the tropical rainforest, I believe that even if the Royal Dutch East India Army successfully retreated to Kendalingen, the non-combat casualties would not be low. Unlike Pontianak, there are very few Chinese in Kendalingen. 70% of the local residents are Borneans, 25% are Dayaks, and the remaining scattered population is a small number of Chinese and Dutch. Unlike the Dutch-Chinese co-governance in Pontianak, Kendalingen is a port completely controlled by the Dutch. Kendalingen is only 550 kilometers away from Batavia by sea. It was an important bridgehead for the Dutch to infiltrate Borneo at the beginning, and it was also their nest in West Borneo. The Dutch East India authorities deployed far more troops in Kendalingen than in Pontianak. As for East Wanlu, it is the capital of the Lanfang Company. The gold mines of the Lanfang Company are also mainly distributed near East Wanlu. The tens of thousands of soldiers of the Lanfang Company all rely on the gold mines in Dongwonlu for their livelihood. As long as we take Dongwonlu next, the Lanfang Company will surely fall apart. Ye Teng, who suggested that Liang Zhao take Dongwonlu in one go and directly cut off the financial resources of the Lanfang Company. Does the Lanfang Company really have tens of thousands of soldiers? Liang Zhao asked. There are not many Chinese on the island of Borneo. The employees of each company usually mine and farm, and take up arms to fight in wartime. The Lanfang Company is no exception. The Lanfang Company can still gather tens of thousands of people. Not to mention the Lanfang Company, even we, the Hakkas who were beaten by the red-haired ghosts and retreated into the mountains and forests to make a living by farming, can gather tens of thousands of people. But whether it is the soldiers of the Lanfang Company or the soldiers of our Chinese Resistance Company, they are not as professional as the soldiers of Mr. Liang, Liu Shanbang said. Liu Shanbang wanted to say that the combat effectiveness of the Lanfang soldiers was about the same as that of the Green Camp of the Qing dynasty, but Hong Mengxiang was present, so Liu Shanbang was not convenient to say so, and he had to give some face to the admiral. In fact, Liang Zhao also regarded the military force of the Lanfang Company as the Green Camp of the Qing dynasty. After all, the military force of the Lanfang Company was built based on the Green Camp. Its combat effectiveness may be slightly higher than that of the Green Camp, but this does not make any essential difference to Liang Zhao. No matter how elite the Green Camp is, it is still the Green Camp. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 399 North or South. Although Liang Zhao has occupied Pontianak, it is now just an isolated city. The pro-Dutch Lanfang Company forces in Dongwonlu in the north and the Dutch Indonesian authorities in South Borneo are still Liang Zhao's biggest concerns. As for his partner, the Chinese Resistance Company headed by the Dagon Company, their base camp is currently in Luai, Montreux, which is located in Sanfa. Between Luai and Pontianak is Dongwonlu controlled by the Lanfang Company. Now we have two choices. One is to march south, capture Kendalingen, and then enter South Borneo to drive the Dutch Indonesian authorities out of Borneo. The second is to march north, capture Dongwonlu, and open up our connection with the Chinese Resistance Company headed by the Dagon Company, after returning to his residence, which was the residence of Anderson, the former commander of the Dutch Indonesian Army in Pontianak. Elvis pointed to the simple map and said to Liang Zhao, "Going south or north is a question that Liang Zhao has to make an immediate choice. In this expedition to West Borneo, his biggest enemy is the army of the Dutch East Indies. If the army of the Dutch East Indies can be driven into the sea, the outcome of the war will be settled. But does he have the ability to drive the Royal Dutch East Indies Army into the sea now?" Liang Zhao thought about this question seriously. Unlike the expedition to Japan, when he set out on the expedition to Japan, he already knew that this was a war that must be won. Among the factors are the understanding of the direction of history and the confidence in his own strength. Now facing the Dutch, Liang Zhao is also blind, and he has no idea whether he can win. He has confidence in his army, but not much confidence in his navy. If you want to fight Kendaangan, attacking Kendaangan from land is not the best choice. To attack Kendaangan from land, Liang Zhao's army needs to pass through the tropical rainforest in the south. The island of Borneo in this area is very underdeveloped. There are several major cities, and what comes into view is the endless primitive jungle. Marching south from the primitive jungle, Liang Zhao will first face a large number of non-combat casualties. Let's not talk about whether Kendaangan can be taken in the end. Even if it is taken, Liang Zhao may not be able to accept the price paid. Marching in the tropical rainforest is not only a great test for the combat troops, but also a great test for his logistical capabilities. More importantly, the Chinese have very weak foundations in Kendaangan and even the entire island of South Borneo. Even if it is taken at a huge cost, whether it can establish effective rule is also a big problem. If we march north and fight Dongwanlu, the situation will be different. Although marching north also requires passing through the tropical jungle. But West Borneo is the base camp of the Chinese on the island of Borneo. After more than 70 years of development by the Chinese, the traffic conditions here are better than those in South Borneo. Liu Shanbang, Yu Tenghu and others have all worked in the Lanfang Company, and they are relatively more familiar with the geographical conditions nearby, and can lead the way for him. Moreover, compared with the Royal Dutch East India Army, the equipment and combat effectiveness of the Lanfang Company's armed forces are weaker. These soldiers who fight for the interests of the Lanfang Company's senior management and are treated poorly, I think their combat effectiveness will not be too strong. More importantly, the residents of Dongwanlu and Luai are all Chinese. Liang Zhao can establish effective rule by taking these places. First, Yi and then the south. After integrating the Chinese on the island of West Borneo, he will focus on dealing with the Dutch forces in South Borneo. Forcing the Dutch Indonesian authorities to sit down at the negotiation table for negotiation is also a good choice. To resist foreign aggression, we must first stabilize the country. Let's go north and take Dongwanlu first. Liang Zhao pointed to Dongwanlu, which was prominently marked on the map and said, "Which unit is responsible for this military operation?" Elvis' eyes lit up and looked at Liang Zhao eagerly. His expression had betrayed him. Elvis must have hoped that the Cactus Regiment, that is, the Arizona Infantry Regiment, would be the main attacker. Elvis was the military commander of the Arizona Infantry Regiment, and naturally hoped that his troops could show their skills in this war. Although the Arizona Infantry Regiment also had actual combat experience, the California Infantry Regiment had also participated in the wars that the Arizona Infantry Regiment had participated in. Moreover, in these wars, the California Infantry Regiment was the protagonist and undertook the main combat tasks. This time, the Arizona Infantry Regiment was fully staffed and well organized, and was fully capable of independently undertaking combat missions. The Arizona Infantry Regiment is responsible for this military operation. Liang Zhao followed Elvis's wishes and gave Elvis a chance to perform. Yes, Elvis happily saluted Liang Zhao and said excitedly, "Umbrella still has more than 500 armed forces, all of whom are veterans. I will also transfer them to you," Liang Zhao said as he looked at the umbrella flag and the California bear flag fluttering in the wind in front of the mansion. This military operation did not have the official permission of Congress and was launched in the name of Umbrella. Therefore, Liang Zhao was not in a position to hang the stars and stripes, and of course, he did not really want to hang the stars and stripes. "General, can you give me another artillery company?" Elvis took the opportunity to say. "You are being too arrogant, right? I only brought 2 artillery companies this time." Liang Zhao rolled his eyes at Elvis. He had already transferred an artillery company to Kruger, and now he only had 1 artillery company left. If all of them were given to Elvis, the troops guarding Pontianak would face the embarrassing situation of having no artillery available. But considering that the Dutch Indian Army counterattacked Pontianak from the land, the probability of a surprise attack was very small. Elvis was fighting a tough battle this time, so it was necessary to transfer some artillery to Elvis. After weighing the pros and cons, Liang Zhao decided to transfer some artillery to Elvis. There is not a company, only 2 platoons at most. Thank you, General. I will definitely take Pontianak and never let you down. Elvis was very happy. This is the first time that the Arizona Infantry Regiment has participated in a military operation independently. We must strictly enforce military discipline. Do you understand? Liang Zhao finally explained to Elvis. Liang Zhao had to stay in Pontianak to take charge of the rear, and he could not personally lead the troops to attack Dongwonlu this time. After taking Dongwonlu, Liang Zhao wanted to establish a stable rule in Dongwonlu, not just take Dongwonlu. He did not want to cause trouble for the subsequent integration work due to the military discipline of the troops. I understand. Please rest assured, General. Elvis patted his chest and assured Liang Zhao. The treatment of the Western Brigade was well known. Looking at the entire U.S. Army, I am afraid that there is no army whose treatment can be compared with that of the Western Brigade. Given the treatment of the Western Brigade, Elvis was confident that he could control the soldiers going out. Chapter 400. Is it worth it? There are too few berths in Pontianak port. We need to add a few more berths, and we also need to add yards and warehouses. After Elvis left Pontianak and entered Dongwonlu, the home of Lanfang Company, Liang Zhao, who was stationed in Pontianak, decided to invest some money in Pontianak's infrastructure after investigation. With his current strength, the low level of development of Borneo Island, and inconvenient transportation, it is unrealistic to want to control the entire Borneo Island. But it is still possible to control the coastal strongholds, form lines from points, and then slowly control most of Borneo Island, especially the rich coastal areas. California Ports has experience in expanding the port of San Francisco, the port of Los Angeles, and the Pearl Harbor. There should be no problem in letting them do this. But it will cost a lot of money. San Francisco is the largest port on the West Coast, and Los Angeles has oil. Expanding the ports in these 2 places will pay for itself in a short period of time. But Pontianak has nothing. Is it worth it to invest money here? Speaking of expanding ports, Deng Wencan couldn't help but think of the 3 ports of San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Pearl Harbor. The 3 ports of San Francisco have already paid for themselves. After the discovery of oil in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles area has been rising day by day, and it is only a matter of time before the investment in the port pays for itself. As for Pearl Harbor, it is still maintained by the American group at a cost. If we want to make an analogy, the situation of Pontianak port is similar to that of Pearl Harbor. Both are isolated overseas, not in California, and no high-value strategic resources such as oil have been discovered for the time being. As for rubber, it will take at least 8 years for rubber trees to mature. Pearl Harbor is a transit point connecting California and East Asia, and it is necessary to maintain it, but is it necessary to invest heavily in Pontianak? Deng Wenkang was upset about this. It's worth it. If you want to achieve great things, you still have to take a long-term view. Liang Zhao stared at the simple Pontianak port and said, if we control Pontianak, we will have the hope of controlling Borneo Island. If we control Borneo Island, we can project influence to the whole Southeast Asia. There are many Chinese in Southeast Asia. As long as we can be tough here, they will seek our protection. By then, it will only be a matter of time to squeeze the Dutch out of Southeast Asia. Them? Come on. Before the Lanfang was destroyed, they quarreled over the division of the Dongwonlu gold mine. They can't work together. It's difficult to rely on them to deal with the Dutch. Deng Wenkang shook his head and said, did I ever say that I wanted to destroy Lanfang? Liang Zhao said with a smile, if they were united, we wouldn't have a chance to interfere in the affairs here, which is why I sent you here. After all, there were only a few people in the Lanfang company who were willing to serve the Dutch as traitors. Liang Zhao's purpose of sending troops to Dongwonlu was not to destroy the Lanfang company, but to change the management of the Lanfang company, eliminate the traitors among them, and then let Umbrella merge with the Lanfang company. How to deal with those captives and Dutch expatriates? Although there are only a little over 3,000 of them, it is a considerable expense to support them. Deng Wenkang asked Liang Zhao how to deal with the captives. 3,000 people? I remember that we only captured 700 to 800 Dutch sailors and Dutch soldiers. Where did more than 3,000 people come from? Liang Zhao felt that this number was wrong. The Dutch, including expatriates, only had 1,200 people, but the native soldiers captured one after another were many as 2,500. These natives were either local pro-Dutch chiefdom soldiers or soldiers of the Dutch Royal Dutch Indonesian Army, Deng Wenkang reported to Liang Zhao. We are short of manpower to develop the rubber plantation. Send them to open up the wasteland. As for the Dutch, let them have enough food. The food expenses will be settled with the Dutch later, Liang Zhao said, scratching the stubble on his chin. The local chiefdom is so poor that they certainly can't afford to redeem people. Of course, they won't redeem them even if they have money. As for the prisoners of the Dutch Royal Dutch Indonesian Army, the Europeans and the White Dutch Indonesian authorities will definitely pay for their redemption. The Dutch don't care about the lives of the Javanese and other ethnic natives. Liang Zhao does not lack excellent army soldiers, but he lacks qualified naval soldiers, especially experienced and qualified naval soldiers. These captured Dutch crew members are all very good crew members. If they can win over these crew members with rich sailing experience and combat experience, they can also improve their maritime power in a relatively short time. With so many prisoners, are the Dutch willing to pay for the redemption? Deng Wenkang was a little worried. They are willing to pay. What the Dutch lack is not money, but people, Liang Zhao said very confidently. These are more than 1,200 Dutch and other European captives. Even if the Dutch Indonesian authorities do not want to pay for their redemption, the public opinion in the Netherlands will not agree. Yes, I understand, Deng Wenkang nodded and agreed. Are there any news from the nearby chiefdoms? Liang Zhao asked about the local chiefdoms. I have sent someone to pass on the message. Yi Tenghu said that the local natives are intimidated by the Dutch power and are unable to make a decision for the time being. They dare not come to Pontianak to see you, Deng Wenkang said. But the chief of the Pontianak chiefdom, Alkadri, has a more ambiguous attitude towards us, but he dare not express his position openly, fearing that the Dutch will settle accounts later. There are many chiefdoms on the island of Borneo, but in West Borneo, the chiefdoms that Liang Zhao needs to deal with are only the Pontianak chiefdom in the south, the Sampha chiefdom in the north, the Sintang chiefdom in the east, and the Brunei chiefdom in the northeast. Except for the Brunei chiefdom, which is pro-British, the rest of the chiefdoms are pro-Dutch chiefdoms. Liang Zhao wanted to maintain a relatively stable control over the West Borneo region centered on Pontianak for a long time, so he had to weaken and even eliminate the influence of the Dutch Indochina authorities on these chiefdoms. They are worried that the Dutch will settle accounts with them later, but they are not worried that I will settle accounts with them now, Liang Zhao sneered. Give them an ultimatum. Either they come to Pontianak to see me obediently, or I will send troops to invite them to Pontianak and let them choose. It will be faster to settle accounts with them from Pontianak than from Batavia. Cruzan fled back to their old nest Batavia with the remnants of his defeated army. After this battle, the East Indies fleet suffered heavy losses. This is the biggest loss suffered by the Dutch Indochina authorities since this century. And the cause of this loss was actually the private armed forces of an American politician, which was unacceptable to the governor of Batavia, Tevez. Use our naval guns to teach these yellow-skinned monkeys a lesson, and teach the arrogant Americans a lesson. This was the slogan shouted by the Dutch in Batavia before the East Indies. The defeat of the East Indies fleet led to fewer voices like this in Batavia. Many people believe that it was because they underestimated the enemy that they lost the naval battle. The defeat of the East Indies fleet was not the worst news for Tevez. Soon, even worse news was delivered to the desk of the governor's office. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.